At 16 years old, my stepmother blamed me for a crime I did not commit, and my own father left me bleeding at the emergency room doors. He told me to never come back. He said we were done. An hour later, the hospital called him in an absolute panic. Because when the trauma nurse walked into my room and saw exactly who was sitting beside my hospital bed, her hands started to tremble. She just kept whispering that it could not be true. My family thought they had thrown away garbage that night. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to an empire. Liquidate your retirement accounts by Friday, Chloe. It is the absolute least you can do. The heavy cream envelope slid across the polished mahogany table, stopping just inches from my untouched glass of water. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. The private dining room at the upscale Atlanta steakhouse smelled of roasted garlic, seared wagyu, and suffocating hypocrisy. I had been summoned here under the guise of a family reconciliation. My father, Calvin, had called me for the first time in 19 years, his voice weak, claiming his heart was failing, and he wanted to make amends before it was too late. Instead, I was staring at a medical bill for $250,000. I looked up at Vanessa, my stepmother. She sat across from me, dripping in pearls that probably cost more than the surgery my father supposedly needed. Her posture was rigid, her expression locked into the same disdainful sneer she had worn since the day she married my father. Beside her sat my stepsister Maya, swirling an olive in her martini glass, looking completely bored by the entire interaction. "It is for your father's heart bypass surgery," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial patience as if she were explaining basic math to a toddler. "His insurance will not cover the out-of-network specialists he requires. We know you have been working those little administrative jobs for years now. You are single with no dependents. Cashing out whatever small 401k you have managed to scrape together is the only logical solution." I leaned back in my leather chair, studying the man who shared my DNA. Calvin sat at the head of the table, looking pale but entirely complicit. He would not meet my eyes. He just stared down at his half-eaten prime rib, letting his wife do the dirty work. "You want me to empty my life savings to pay for a surgery you cannot afford?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Do not use that tone with me," Maya snapped, setting her glass down hard enough that the crystal rang out. "You owe us, Chloe. You have owed us for 19 years. Mom and Dad kept you out of juvenile detention when you went crazy and attacked her. Paying this bill is the bare minimum you should do to repay that debt." I felt a cold calm wash over me. For nearly 2 decades, I had waited for this exact conversation. They actually believed the lie they had told themselves. They actually believed I was still the terrified, powerless teenager they had discarded. "Saved me." I repeated the words hanging in the quiet room. "You mean the juvenile detention I supposedly deserved, because I found the bank statements proving you stole my dead mother's life insurance, Vanessa. The same year I was scrubbing cafeteria floors at night to pay for my own biology textbooks, while you bought Maya a brand new Mercedes for getting a C average." "Do not speak to your mother that way," Calvin finally barked, slamming his fist on the table. The sudden burst of energy made him wince and clutch his chest, but his arrogance remained entirely intact. "She protected you. She lied to the police to keep you out of a cell after you threw yourself into that glass table in a manic fit. You are ungrateful, and you have always been a violent delinquent." "She is not my mother," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. "And I did not throw myself into anything. She shoved me because she was terrified I was going to show you the credit card debt she racked up in your name. And you were too much of a coward to look at the truth, so you dragged me to the hospital bleeding from my head and left me in the parking lot." "That is enough." The voice belonged to Connor, Maya's husband. He was a wealthy venture capitalist, a white man born into privilege, who had spent the entire dinner looking at me like I was something he had scraped off his shoe. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, projecting an air of absolute authority. "Let me break this down for you in terms you can understand," Chloe, Connor said, using the slow, patronizing tone of a man accustomed to bullying his way through corporate boardrooms. "We are not asking for your permission. We are giving you instructions. My firm retains some of the most aggressive corporate attorneys in Atlanta. If you refuse to sign a promissory note for this medical debt tonight, I will personally have them file a civil suit against you for the damages you caused Vanessa 19 years ago." I simply watched him, letting him talk. We will tie you up in litigation for years. Connor continued, a smug smile spreading across his face. We will garnish your measly administrative wages. We will freeze whatever pathetic bank accounts you have. You do not understand how real wealth operates in this city. You do not have the resources to fight us. You will sign the papers, hand over the money, and apologize to your father. If you do not, we will take everything you have. Maya smiled, linking her arm through his. Connor is right, Chloe. Stop playing the victim and do what you are told. Daddy is dying and you are being selfish. The silence in the room stretched tight. They sat there, an impenetrable wall of entitlement and cruelty waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected me to beg. They expected the terrified 16-year-old girl to surface and surrender. Instead, I raised my hand and signaled the waiter who had been nervously hovering near the door. He hurried over, holding a thick black leather checkbook. Connor chuckled and gestured toward me. Give it to her, Connor instructed the waiter. Since she is being so difficult about helping the family, she can at least cover the dinner. I am sure putting $3,000 on her credit card will not completely bankrupt her. The waiter looked uncomfortable but placed the leather book in front of me. I opened it, glanced at the exorbitant total of the vintage wines and imported steaks they had gorged themselves on, and reached into my handbag. I did not pull out a standard bank card. I pulled out a heavy solid gold Centurion card. The dull metallic thud it made when I dropped it onto the leather folder echoed in the quiet room. The waiter's eyes went wide. He picked it up with both hands, treating it like a holy relic. Take care of the entire bill, I told the waiter, my voice smooth and polite. And add a 40% tip for your excellent service tonight. Right away, ma'am, the waiter stammered, backing out of the room. Connor's smug smile vanished. He stared at the spot where the gold card had been, his brow furrowing as his brain tried to process what he had just seen. Maya looked confused, glancing between her husband and me. Vanessa's posture faltered, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I picked up the cream envelope containing the $250,000 medical bill and tossed it directly onto Calvin's empty plate. I do not fund strangers, I said, looking directly into Calvin's eyes. You have exactly 24 hours to find a way to pay for that surgery yourself, because you are not getting a single dime from me. Connor stood up, kicking his chair back. His face was flushing a deep, angry red. A piece of heavy plastic does not save you from a lawsuit, you arrogant brat, he spat. I do not care whose credit card you borrowed to put on a show tonight. My lawyers will serve you with papers by tomorrow afternoon. I will ruin you. I picked up my purse and looked at Connor with a level of pity that made him clench his jaw. You might want to check your email, Connor, I said softly. Specifically, the corporate buyout notification that went out to all executive partners at 9 o'clock this morning. Connor froze. What are you talking about? I am the one who just bought the controlling shares of your venture capital firm, I replied, watching the color completely drain from his face. I do not know how you missed the announcement, but your firm was acquired by Sterling Medical Holdings. I am the chief executive officer. You do not have a legal team anymore, Connor. You have my legal team. And I highly suggest you pack up your desk by tomorrow morning because you are officially terminated. I did not wait to see his legs give out. I did not wait to hear Vanessa scream or Calvin gasp for air. I turned my back on the people who had thrown me away and walked out of the dining room. The sound of my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own making. I walked out of the private dining room without looking back. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Connor sputtering in disbelief and Maya demanding to know what I meant about buying his firm. The ambient noise of the upscale Atlanta steakhouse washed over me instantly. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, and waiters in crisp white jackets glided across the carpeted floor carrying silver trays. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my breathing steady, as I navigated the crowded main dining area toward the front exit. I was not the scared teenager they remembered. I was a woman who owned the ground she walked on. I reached the valet stand just outside the main doors. The warm, humid Georgia night air hit my face, providing a welcome contrast to the suffocating chill of the room I had just left. I handed my ticket to the attendant, a young man who gave me a polite nod and jogged off to retrieve my car. I stood under the glow of the restaurant awning, enjoying the quiet victory of the moment. Before my car could arrive, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant burst open. Calvin and Vanessa stormed out onto the pavement. Calvin was breathing heavily, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He clutched the left side of his chest, a physical manifestation of the heart condition he had just tried to weaponize against me, to the tune of $250,000. Vanessa flanked him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the concrete. Her hands gripped her expensive handbag like a shield, while her eyes darted around to see if any of the other wealthy patrons were watching them make a scene. "You get back here right now," Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing across the parking lot. I turned around slowly, my expression completely blank. I watched my biological father march toward me, looking completely unhinged. "Do not walk away from your family!" Calvin shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You arrogant, disrespectful little brat. You think because you wear a nice suit and carry a fancy credit card you can speak to us like that? We saved your life. You have always been a violent delinquent, and this is how you repay us." I was doing it again. He was falling right back into the same toxic playbook he had used 19 years ago, relying on volume and rage to force me into submission. Vanessa stood right behind his shoulder, nodding emphatically, playing the role of the terrified but devoted wife. "I'll belong in a jail cell, Chloe." Vanessa chimed in, her voice shrill and trembling with manufactured panic. "I protected you. I kept you out of the system after you attacked me. I could have pressed charges when you went crazy and threw yourself into that coffee table, but I showed you mercy. And you dare to threaten my son-in-law. You dare to refuse your father the money he needs to live." I looked at Vanessa, and then I looked at Calvin. For 19 years they had told that lie so many times they actually believed it had become the truth. They had built an entire reality where I was a monster and they were the generous saviors. I took a slow step forward. The space between us suddenly felt charged with electric tension. "I did not attack you, Vanessa," I said, my voice low, but carrying absolute authority. "You shoved me. You shoved a 16-year-old girl into a solid glass table because I found the bank statements hidden in your bottom drawer. The statements that proved you stole $60,000 from my dead mother's life insurance policy to pay off your luxury shopping debts." Calvin flinched, but he immediately shook his head, refusing to accept the words. "That is a lie," he spat. "You were out of control. You were screaming and you tripped. Vanessa was trying to calm you down. She shoved me," I repeated, taking another step closer, and my head hit the corner of the glass. I was bleeding everywhere. I could not see straight. I was concussed and terrified. "And you, Calvin, you dragged me out to your car not to help me but to hide the evidence. You drove me to the emergency room and you stopped at the sliding doors." The memory flared up in my mind so vivid I could almost taste the copper of blood in my mouth. I remembered the cold leather of his car seats. I remembered begging him to stay with me. "You did not even walk me inside," I continued, holding his gaze hostage. "You unlocked the passenger door and you pushed me out onto the pavement. You looked down at your own daughter bleeding from a head wound and you told me to never come back. You said we were done. Then you drove away to protect a woman who had just robbed your child." Vanessa crossed her arms, looking around nervously as a valet attendant walked past. "Keep your voice down, Chloe. You are making a scene over ancient history. We did what we had to do. You were a troubled kid." I ignored her, keeping my focus entirely on the man who had abandoned me. "Do you know what happened after you drove away, Calvin?" I asked. "Do you know what happened when I was sitting in that trauma room alone with a towel pressed to my head, waiting for someone to stitch me back together?" "I do not care what happened," Calvin snarled, though his voice wavered slightly. "You survived, obviously. You are standing here acting like you own the world. An hour after you left me, the hospital called you," I said, ignoring his interruption. "The trauma nurse called you because she needed a guardian's consent to treat a minor. You told her I was a ward of the state and hung up the phone. But right after you hung up, that nurse walked back into my room and she froze. Her hands started trembling, holding my chart. She dropped her clipboard on the floor, and she just kept whispering that it could not be true." Calvin's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "She was trembling because of the woman sitting in the chair next to my bed," I explained, watching the confusion slowly spread across his face. "A woman who had been walking out of the hospital administration wing and saw you dump me on the curb. A woman who recognized me because she sponsored the state science fair I had won the month before." Vanessa rolled her eyes. Are we supposed to care who was sitting next to you? Some social worker. Not a social worker, I said, my lips curving into a sharp, cold smile. Dr. Serena Sterling. The name hung in the humid air like a physical weight. Calvin's mouth parted slightly. In Atlanta, the name Serena Sterling was royalty. She was a notoriously ruthless, brilliant billionaire. She was an African-American pioneer who built the largest private hospital network in the Southeast from the ground up. She was power incarnate. Dr. Sterling took me home that night. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. She legally emancipated me. She paid for my education. She mentored me every single day for 19 years. She taught me how to read financial statements, how to audit corrupt companies, and how to destroy anyone who tried to take what belonged to me. She was the mother Vanessa could never be, and the father you failed to be. Calvin's face drained of all color. He took a stumbling step backward, his hand gripping his chest much tighter this time. Dr. Sterling died last month. He stammered, the realization hitting him like a freight train. It was all over the news. She had no children. She had no heirs. Yes, she died, I said softly. And she left everything to the girl you threw away in her parking lot. I am the sole heir to the Sterling Medical Network. I am the chief executive officer of the entire healthcare system. Vanessa let out a small, choked gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She finally understood exactly who she had been insulting at the dinner table. My black chauffeured town car pulled up to the curb, gliding silently to a stop right beside us. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I looked at Calvin, who was now shaking, visibly grasping the magnitude of his mistake. Including the cardiology wing, where you are scheduled for your bypass surgery tomorrow morning, I added, letting the words sink deep into his failing heart. I strongly suggest you find a new hospital by dawn, Calvin. Because Sterling Medical turns away nobody except the man who left me bleeding on the pavement. I stepped into the back of my car, settling into the plush leather seat. I did not look back as the driver closed the door, shutting out their panicked voices. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving them stranded in the glow of the streetlights, I felt nothing but absolute total freedom. I left the private dining room without a single backward glance. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Connor sputtering in total disbelief and Maya demanding to know what I meant about buying his firm. The ambient noise of the upscale Atlanta steakhouse washed over me instantly. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, and waiters in crisp white jackets glided across the carpeted floor carrying silver trays. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my breathing steady, as I navigated the crowded main dining area toward the front exit. I was not the scared teenager they remembered. I was a woman who owned the ground she walked on. I reached the valet stand just outside the main doors. The warm, humid Georgia night air hit my face, providing a welcome contrast to the suffocating chill of the room I had just left. I handed my ticket to the attendant, a young man who gave me a polite nod and jogged off to retrieve my car. I stood under the glow of the restaurant awning, enjoying the quiet victory of the moment. I had just dismantled the golden son-in-law and protected my peace. But I knew the real battle was not over. The true architects of my pain were still inside, and they were not going to let me walk away that easily. Before my car could arrive, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant burst open. Calvin and Vanessa stormed out onto the pavement. Calvin was breathing heavily, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He clutched the left side of his chest, a physical manifestation of the heart condition he had just tried to weaponize against me to the tune of $250,000. Vanessa flanked him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the concrete. Her hands gripped her expensive handbag like a shield, while her eyes darted around to see if any of the other wealthy patrons were watching them make a scene. "You get back here right now!" Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing across the parking lot. I turned around slowly, my expression completely blank. I watched my biological father march toward me, looking completely unhinged. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, a man who had spent his entire life bullying his way through family disputes. Seeing me defy him and casually destroy his daughter's husband had shattered his illusion of control. "Do not walk away from your family!" Calvin shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You arrogant, disrespectful little brat. You think because you wear a nice suit and carry a fancy credit card, you can speak to us like that. We saved your life. You have always been a violent delinquent, and this is how you repay us. I was doing it again. He was falling right back into the same toxic playbook he had used 19 years ago, relying on volume and rage to force me into submission. Vanessa stood right behind his shoulder, nodding emphatically, playing the role of the terrified but devoted wife. "I'll belong in a jail cell," Chloe Vanessa chimed in, her voice shrill and trembling with manufactured panic. "I protected you. I kept you out of the system after you attacked me. I could have pressed charges when you went crazy and threw yourself into that coffee table, but I showed you mercy. And you dare to threaten my son-in-law. You dare to refuse your father the money he needs to live." I looked at Vanessa and then I looked at Calvin. For 19 years they had told that lie so many times they actually believed it had become the truth. They had built an entire reality where I was a monster and they were the generous saviors. They had spent nearly 2 decades wrapping themselves in a blanket of victimhood, while I spent those same years building an empire from the ground up. They wanted me to bow down and fund their extravagant lifestyle out of some twisted sense of obligation. It was sickening. I took a slow step forward. The space between us suddenly felt charged with electric tension. The valet attendant paused a few feet away, unsure if he should intervene. A well-dressed couple leaving the restaurant stopped near their car, turning to watch the unfolding drama. I did not care who was watching. I did not care about the public spectacle. I was absolutely done carrying their toxic secrets. "I did not attack you, Vanessa," I said, my voice low but carrying absolute authority. "You shoved me. You shoved a 16-year-old girl into a solid glass table because I found the bank statements hidden in your bottom desk drawer." Calvin flinched, but he immediately shook his head, refusing to accept the words. "That is a lie," he spat, stepping in front of Vanessa as if to shield her. "You were out of control. You were screaming and you tripped. Vanessa was trying to calm you down and keep you from hurting yourself. She shoved me," I repeated, taking another step closer, forcing Calvin to hold his ground. "I want you to listen to me, Calvin. I want you to hear the truth that you have been too much of a coward to face for 19 years. She shoved me because she was terrified I was going to show you the truth about her finances. The statements that proved she stole $60,000 from my dead mother's life insurance policy to pay off her luxury shopping debts and fund Maya's lifestyle." Vanessa gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked around wildly, realizing that the bystanders were listening to every single word. "Calvin, stop her," Vanessa pleaded, tugging at his jacket sleeve. "She is having another episode. She is making things up to hurt us. She just wants to ruin our reputation." "I am not making anything up," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable clarity. "You drained the account my mother left for my college tuition. You bought designer clothes and expensive vacations while telling Calvin the business was struggling and we had to cut back on expenses. And when I confronted you in the living room, you lost your mind. You grabbed me by the shoulders and you threw me backward with all your strength." Calvin shook his head violently, his breathing growing more ragged. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I saw you. I saw the blood on your hands. I saw what you did to her. You saw what she told you to see." I countered, my gaze locking onto his, refusing to let him look away. "You walked into the house and saw me bleeding on the carpet. You saw your new wife crying fake tears, claiming I had gone insane and attacked her out of nowhere. And instead of asking your own daughter what happened, instead of taking care of the child you were supposed to protect, you chose to believe the woman who had just robbed me blind." The air in the parking lot felt thick and heavy. The arrogant bluster was slowly draining out of Calvin, replaced by a creeping sense of panic. I was realizing that he could not silence me anymore. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and he was entirely unarmed. He was standing in front of a woman who could not be intimidated or bought. "You dragged me out to your car," I continued, my words striking him like physical blows. "Not to help me, but to hide the evidence of what your wife had done before the neighbors could call the police. I was bleeding everywhere. I could not see straight. I was concussed and terrified and completely dependent on you to keep me safe. And what did you do, Calvin?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The truth was cornering him, stripping away the righteous anger he had worn like armor for almost 2 decades. You drove me to the emergency room, and you stopped at the sliding doors, I said, stepping so close to him I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. You did not even walk me inside to make sure I was treated. You unlocked the passenger door and you pushed me out onto the pavement. You looked down at your own daughter bleeding from a head wound and you told me to never come back. You said we were done. Then you drove away to protect a woman who had just destroyed my life. Vanessa tried to intervene again, her voice cracking with forced emotion. We did what we had to do to protect our family. You were a danger to us. You needed professional help that we could not provide. I ignored her, keeping my focus entirely on the man who had abandoned me. The memory of that night flared up in my mind so vivid I could almost taste the copper of blood in my mouth. I remembered the cold leather of his car seats pressing against my cheek. I remembered begging him to stay with me, pleading with him not to leave me alone in the dark. I remembered the blinding fluorescent lights of the hospital entrance as his taillights disappeared into the rainy night. That night broke me, Calvin, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried over the sound of the distant highway traffic. But it also saved me. Because what you and your wife did not realize was that leaving me at that hospital was the greatest gift you could have ever given me. You thought you were throwing away a problem so you could live your perfect suburban life in peace. You had no idea you were setting me up to take over the world. Calvin stared at me, his eyes wide and fearful. What are you talking about? He breathed, his hands shaking at his sides. I took a deep breath, letting the sensory details of that traumatic memory wash over me, not with pain, but with power. The transition from the vulnerable, bleeding teenager to the unstoppable woman standing before him was complete. The parking lot around us faded away as the reality of that fateful night 19 years ago finally came to light. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, stepping back into the chilling hospital corridor. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the beeping monitors, and the absolute terror of being a discarded child all rushed back. But this time I was not a victim. I was the architect of my own redemption. 19 years ago, the air in our modest suburban home felt thick with unspoken resentment. I was 16 years old, wearing a faded high school sweatshirt and trying to finish a biology project at the kitchen table. My biological mother had passed away 5 years prior, leaving behind a life insurance policy that was supposed to guarantee my college education. Calvin had married Vanessa shortly after, and she moved in with her daughter Maya, immediately taking over every corner of our lives. That afternoon, I needed a stapler for my project. I walked into the home office, a room Vanessa had claimed entirely for herself. I opened the bottom drawer of her heavy oak desk, hoping to find office supplies. Instead, my hand brushed against a thick stack of bank statements hidden beneath a pile of old magazines. I recognized the account number on the top page. It was the trust account my mother had established for me. I pulled the statements out, my curiosity overriding my sense of privacy. As I read down the columns of numbers, my heart began to pound against my ribs. The account was practically empty. $60,000 had been drained over the course of 2 years. I stared at the withdrawal records, tracking the money as it flowed directly into Vanessa's personal checking accounts. There were charges for high-end boutiques, luxury spa retreats, and down payments for Maya's expensive private school trips. The future my mother had literally traded her life to secure for me had been squandered on designer handbags and country club dinners. I did not hear Vanessa walk into the room until her sharp voice shattered the silence. "What are you doing in my desk?" She snapped, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. I turned around, the bank statements shaking in my hands. "You stole from me," I said, my voice cracking with a mixture of grief and raw teenage anger. "You drained my mother's life insurance. You took my college money." Vanessa's face went perfectly pale before flushing with a dangerous, ugly red. Her carefully crafted image of the elegant Southern housewife dropped instantly, revealing the vicious opportunist hiding underneath. She lunged across the room, grabbing for the papers. "Give me those right now, you snooping little brat!" she hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my wrists. "You have no right to look through my private property." "It is my property," I shouted, holding the papers out of her reach. "This was my mother's money. I am going to show this to Dad. I am going to tell him exactly what you are. The mention of Calvin triggered a pure, desperate panic in Vanessa. She knew that if Calvin saw the financial records, her luxurious ride would be over. She backed me out of the office and into the center of the living room, grabbing at my clothes, trying to wrestle the evidence from my grip. I was smaller than her, exhausted from scrubbing floors at my part-time job, and completely unprepared for physical violence. "Give them to me," Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I pulled away, turning my back to protect the documents. That was when she lost her mind. She planted her hands firmly between my shoulder blades and shoved me forward with every ounce of strength she possessed. I lost my footing on the thick rug. My arms flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto. I went pitching forward directly toward the heavy glass coffee table sitting in the middle of the room. The impact was deafening. My forehead struck the sharp, beveled edge of the glass top before my weight shattered the entire pane. A horrible crunching sound filled my ears, followed by a blinding flash of white light. I crumpled to the floor, gasping for air as a dozen jagged shards of glass rained down around me. Immediate agonizing pain radiated from my temple. I pressed my hands to my face and they came away completely slick with warm blood. I was disoriented, my vision swimming in and out of focus. The room was spinning. I tried to push myself up, but my arms trembled and gave out. Then the front door clicked open. Calvin walked into the house, his briefcase in hand. He stopped dead in the foyer, taking in the scene, the shattered coffee table, the blood staining the white carpet. His teenage daughter writhing on the floor. Before I could even force a word out of my mouth, Vanessa dropped to her knees. She let out a piercing, theatrical scream, clutching her own arms and hyperventilating. "Calvin, she is crazy!" Vanessa wailed, forcing huge crocodile tears to stream down her face. She was digging through my things, and when I asked her to stop, she just went completely manic. She started screaming that she hated us. She attacked me, Calvin. I tried to hold her back, but she threw herself into the table. "She is dangerous. You have to get her out of here." I looked up at my father through a haze of pain and blood. "Dad," I whispered, my voice weak. "She shoved me. She stole my money. Please help me." Calvin looked at Vanessa, crying on the floor, and then he looked down at me. I waited for the parental instinct to kick in. I waited for him to rush to my side, to press a towel to my bleeding head, to demand to know why his wife had laid hands on his child. Instead, his face twisted into an expression of absolute profound disgust. He did not ask a single question. He did not check my wounds. He saw a messy, complicated situation that threatened his comfortable new marriage, and he made his choice instantly. "Get up!" Calvin growled, his voice devoid of any warmth or concern. "I cannot," I sobbed, my head pounding so hard I felt nauseous. "I cannot see straight." "I said get up," he roared, grabbing my upper arm and hauling me to my feet. He dragged me, stumbling and bleeding, through the living room, completely ignoring the trail of blood dripping onto the floorboards. He marched me out the front door and shoved me into the passenger seat of his car. The drive to the hospital was a silent nightmare. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into streaks of yellow and red. I sat in the passenger seat, pressing a wad of fast food napkins to my head, trying to stop the bleeding. I looked over at him, hoping to see a flicker of regret or worry in his profile. He just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Dad, please," I tried again, my head throbbing with every bump in the road. "You have to look at the bank statements. She stole from us." "Shut your mouth!" Calvin snapped, not even turning his head. "I am sick of your lies. I am sick of your jealousy toward Maya and your disrespect toward my wife. You have been nothing but a burden since your mother died, and I am entirely done dealing with your violent outbursts." We pulled into the circular driveway of the local emergency room, the bright red neon signs reflecting off the wet pavement. I expected him to park the car. I expected him to walk me inside to the triage desk like any normal parent would do for an injured minor. He did not put the car in park. He kept his foot on the brake right in front of the automatic sliding doors. He leaned across the console, popped the passenger door open, and pushed my shoulder. "Get out," he ordered, his tone colder than the rain falling outside. I stared at him in pure shock. "You are not coming in with me." "I am not doing this anymore," Calvin said, refusing to look me in the eye. "You are a danger to my household. I will not let you ruin my marriage. Get out of the car, Chloe." But where am I supposed to go after I asked, the terror finally settling deep into my bones? I am 16. I do not have anywhere to go. I do not care, he replied, shutting down any remaining shred of humanity he possessed. Don't ever come back. We're done. I stumbled out of the vehicle, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The cold rain hit my face, mixing with the blood pouring from my temple. I grabbed the doorframe, hoping he would change his mind, hoping the man who used to read me bedtime stories would magically reappear and save me. Calvin just reached over, slammed the door shut, and drove away. I stood alone on the concrete island, watching his taillights disappear into the heavy Atlanta storm. I was completely abandoned, injured, and entirely stripped of a family. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering violently, as the automatic doors slid open behind me, letting out a blast of sterile hospital air. I dragged my feet across the threshold, walking into the bright fluorescent glare of the emergency room waiting area. I approached the intake desk, my vision narrowing to a tunnel, my clothes soaked with rain and blood. The triage nurse took one look at me and immediately called for a stretcher. I remember being lifted onto the bed, the stark white lights passing overhead as they wheeled me down the corridor. I remember the sharp sting of the antiseptic and the numbing cold of the local anesthetic as they began to stitch my forehead back together. But mostly, I remember the absolute crushing silence in my chest. The realization that I was entirely untethered from the world. I had no mother, I had no father, I had no home. What Calvin did not know as he sped back to his comfortable house and his lying wife was that his cowardly exit had set a massive chain of events into motion. He thought he was closing a painful chapter of his life. He did not know that by leaving me bleeding at those sliding doors, he had placed me exactly where I needed to be to meet the woman who would teach me how to buy and sell his entire existence. I lay in that trauma room, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the end of the world. Instead, I got a new beginning. The hospital protocol required the staff to contact my legal guardian. About an hour after Calvin drove away, the attending trauma nurse stepped out to make the phone call. She found his number in my school ID records, which were tucked into my damp pocket. I could hear her muffled voice through the thin curtain of my room, explaining my injuries and requesting parental consent for a head scan. When she walked back into my room, however, she was not alone. And the expression on her face had completely transformed from clinical concern to absolute trembling shock. The nurse stood completely frozen in the doorway. The plastic clipboard slipped from her fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp, loud clatter. She did not even look down to retrieve it. Her eyes were fixed on the figure who had quietly bypassed the busy triage desk and stepped into my curtained trauma bay while the nurse was out in the hall. "You!" The nurse gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands started to tremble violently as she smoothed the front of her scrubs. "It cannot be you." I turned my head, wincing as the slight movement pulled at the fresh stitches on my forehead. Sitting in the cheap plastic visitor chair right beside my hospital bed was a woman who looked like she had walked directly out of a financial magazine cover. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over a pristine white silk blouse. Her dark skin was flawless, her posture was immaculate, and her deep brown eyes held a level of absolute authority that seemed to alter the air pressure in the room. This was not a state-appointed social worker. This was Dr. Serena Sterling. Serena did not raise her voice. But when she spoke, the entire emergency room seemed to fall completely silent to listen. "Pick up the chart, nurse." "Davis." Serena instructed, her tone perfectly, even but leaving absolutely no room for hesitation. "And tell me exactly what the man on the phone just said to you." The nurse scrambled to retrieve the clipboard, her face flushed with a mixture of pure terror and awe. She swallowed hard, looking between my bruised face and the billionaire sitting beside me. "He said he is not her father anymore." Dr. Sterling, the nurse stammered, her voice shaking. "He said she is a violent delinquent and to hand her over to the state." He hung up the phone before I could even explain the concussion protocols or the severity of the laceration. I closed my eyes as a fresh wave of tears leaked out, sliding down my temples and burning the edges of my wounds. Hearing Calvin reject me out loud, hearing him throw me away to a stranger. Over the phone shattered the last remaining fragment of hope I had been clinging to. I was entirely alone in the world. Serena slowly nodded. She reached out and gently rested her cool, manicured hand over my shaking fingers. Her touch was incredibly grounding, cutting through the rising tide of my panic. Make a note in the patient file that the biological parent has explicitly refused medical guardianship, Serena told the nurse. Then page Dr. Aris in neurology. I want the chief of neurosurgery down here in exactly 5 minutes to review her scans. Put her entire stay under my personal private account. Do not bill insurance. The nurse practically ran out of the room, desperate to follow the orders of the woman whose name was literally carved into the stone on the front of the hospital building. We were left alone in the quiet hum of the trauma bay, surrounded by the steady rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I looked at her, my 16-year-old brain struggling to process why the most powerful African-American woman in Georgia was sitting next to a bleeding teenager in a public emergency room. I recognized her face from local news broadcasts and prominent charity galas, but having her sitting inches away from me felt entirely surreal. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my throat raw from crying in the cold rain. Serena leaned forward, her dark eyes softening just a fraction. "I was leaving the executive administration wing for the night," she said quietly. "I was walking to my car when I saw a sedan pull up to the emergency doors. I saw a grown man lean across the console, open the passenger door, and shove a bleeding child out into a thunderstorm. I watched him drive away while you stood there shivering on the concrete." She paused, reaching into her designer handbag to pull out a pristine white handkerchief. She gently dabbed a stray drop of rainwater from my cheek. "I followed you inside because nobody deserves to be treated like garbage," Serena continued. "But when you walked under the bright fluorescent lights of the intake desk, I realized I knew exactly who you were, Chloe." I stared at her in complete confusion. I had never met a billionaire in my life. I wore hand-me-down clothes and scrubbed cafeteria floors to buy my own school supplies. We existed in completely different universes. "Last month, I sponsored the Georgia State STEM and Innovation Fair." Serena explained, her voice filled with a quiet, steady warmth that I had not heard since my own mother passed away. "I spent 3 hours walking through aisles of mediocre baking soda volcanoes and generic solar system models. And then I stopped at a booth in the far back corner. I saw a young girl who had mapped the genetic sequence of drought-resistant crops using outdated borrowed lab equipment. I read your entire research binder. It was brilliant. You are brilliant." Tears welled up in my eyes, spilling over my lashes. For years, Calvin and Vanessa had told me I was useless. They told me my passion for science was a total waste of time. They called me a burden and a massive disappointment. Yet the most successful woman I had ever seen had remembered my name because of my mind. She had looked past my worn-out sneakers and seen my potential. "You do not belong to people who throw you away," Serena said softly, her grip on my hand tightening with fierce protective strength. "People who are intimidated by your light will always try to keep you in the dark. Your father looked at you and saw a problem that was ruining his comfortable lies. I look at you and I see the future of medical innovation." I let out a broken sob, finally allowing the crushing weight of the night to release its grip on my chest. I felt like I was free falling, but her hand anchoring mine kept me from hitting the ground. "I do not have anywhere to go." I cried, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. "I do not have any money. I do not have a family anymore." Serena smiled, a sharp, confident expression that made me feel entirely safe for the first time in my life. "You do not need their money, Chloe," she said. "And as of tonight, you do not need their family. I am going to have my legal team file for your full emancipation tomorrow morning. You are coming home with me. I am going to pay for your education. I am going to give you access to the best laboratories in this country. And I am going to teach you exactly how to build an empire." I lay there listening to the steady beep of the monitor, letting her words sink deep into my soul. Calvin thought he was punishing me by leaving me at those sliding doors. He thought he was condemning me to a life of poverty and state facilities. He had no idea that his cowardice was the catalyst for my entire transformation. Over the next 19 years, Serena Sterling became more than just a wealthy benefactor. She became my fierce mentor, my ultimate protector, and the closest thing to a true mother I would ever know. She taught me how to read complex financial statements. She taught me how to walk into a corporate boardroom and command absolute respect without ever raising my voice. She taught me that true power was not about screaming in parking lots, but about moving in silence and striking when your opponents least expect it. We spent years studying the corrupt corporate practices of arrogant men like Connor. We spent years building Sterling Medical Holdings into an unstoppable healthcare juggernaut. Every time I felt a moment of doubt, I would touch the small silver scar near my temple and remember the promise I made to myself in that emergency room. I promised I would never be helpless again. I promised I would become a force of nature that Calvin and Vanessa could not even begin to comprehend. The memory of Serena wiping the rain from my face grounded me in the present moment. I blinked, pulling myself out of the 19-year-old flashback and focusing my attention back on the dark restaurant parking lot. The humid Atlanta air felt heavy around us. Calvin was still standing in front of me, clutching his chest, his face pale with fear under the glow of the streetlights. He was waiting for me to break to revert back to the bleeding teenager he had abandoned, but that girl was gone. Serena Sterling had made sure of it. The name hung in the humid Atlanta air. Serena Sterling. I watched the syllables register in Calvin's mind. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. As a lifelong resident of this city, he knew exactly who she was. Everyone did. Serena Sterling was a titan. She was a woman who had broken through every racial and gender barrier the Southern medical establishment had tried to put in her way. Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Dr. Sterling died, he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous thunder. She passed away just last month. It was all over the local news. The hospital network held a massive memorial service downtown. The mayor spoke. The governor was there. Yes, she did. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the grief that still lived quietly in my chest. And I delivered her eulogy while you were busy trying to figure out how to scam your way out of a medical bill. Vanessa scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She stepped forward, trying to reclaim the upper hand by relying on her usual strategy of sheer condescension. So what? Some rich doctor felt sorry for you and paid your way through a cheap community college. That does not give you the right to disrespect your father. You were a charity case, Chloe. Do not act like you earned anything. You are still the same troubled girl we had to kick out for the safety of our family. I did not go to community college, Vanessa, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step closer. I forced her to shrink back against the side of a parked SUV, her expensive heels scraping awkwardly against the asphalt. I went to Stanford. And Serena did not just pay my tuition out of pity. She recognized a mind that was being wasted in your toxic household. She mentored me. She trained me to navigate corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. She taught me how to spot a fraud from a mile away, which makes looking at you incredibly boring. Calvin clutched his chest harder, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. He was trying to connect the dots, but his arrogant mind still refused to grasp the full picture. You work for Sterling Medical Holdings, he said, pointing a shaky finger at me. That is where you got the money to buy Connor's firm. You used your boss's money to retaliate against your own family. When the board of directors finds out what you did, they will fire you. You are just an employee, Chloe. You are playing a dangerous game with someone else's wealth. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a sound of amusement, but of absolute victory. The sheer audacity of his ignorance was almost poetic. For 19 years he had convinced himself that I was nothing. Now faced with the evidence of my success, his brain was desperately trying to shove me back into a subordinate role. I am not an employee, Calvin, I said, looking him dead in the eye, stripping away the last ounce of his dignity. The parking lot was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic on Peachtree Street. The valet attendant had completely frozen, pretending to arrange keys at his podium, but clearly hanging on every word. Serena did not have any biological children. I continued, keeping my tone measured and precise. She had me. I was the daughter she chose. And when she passed away, she did not just leave me a generous severance package or a token trust fund. She left me the entire network. I am the sole owner. I am the chief executive officer of Sterling Medical Holdings. Vanessa actually stumbled. Her designer heel caught on an uneven patch of pavement, and she had to grab Calvin's arm to keep from falling over. Her mouth gaped open, her perfectly applied lipstick making her look like a terrified clown. She stared at me as if I had just morphed into a monster right in front of her. Calvin looked like he had been physically struck with a baseball bat. The man who had thrown me out of his car like worthless trash was now staring at a billionaire. His eyes darted from my tailored suit to my solid gold credit card, and finally to the sleek black town car, waiting faithfully at the curb. The reality of his situation crashed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. "No," Vanessa whispered, shaking her head frantically. "No, that is impossible. They would not give a hospital empire to someone like you." "They did not give it to me," I corrected her sharply. "I helped build it. While you were laundering money through country club memberships and dodging debt collectors, I was expanding our clinical research divisions. I earned my seat at the head of that boardroom table. And now I hold absolute authority over the largest private healthcare system in the Southeast." Calvin's knees actually buckled slightly. He leaned heavily against the hood of the nearest car, his face dripping with cold sweat. "Chloe," he gasped, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a sickeningly desperate pleading tone. "Chloe, please. I am your father. I gave you life. You have to understand that I was under a lot of pressure back then. I made a mistake, but I always loved you. We are family." The sheer hypocrisy of his words made my stomach turn. 10 minutes ago, I was a violent delinquent who owed him everything. Now that he knew my net worth, I was his beloved family member. "Do not ever use that word with me again," I said, my voice turning to ice. "You forfeited the right to call yourself my father the second you pushed me out of your car into a thunderstorm." I took a step back, putting physical distance between myself and the man who had caused me so much pain. I wanted to look at him clearly. I wanted to burn this image into my memory. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely broken. "That $250,000 surgery you need," I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly calm. "The complex bypass that your out-of-network specialist is supposed to perform tomorrow morning to save your life. Where exactly is that taking place, Calvin?" He could not speak. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror. He opened his mouth, but only a ragged wheeze escaped. "Let me guess," I said, tilting my head slightly. "The Sterling Cardiovascular Institute, the premier facility in the state. The only place within 500 miles equipped with the specific surgical robotics your delicate heart condition requires." Vanessa let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She threw her hands out toward me, her fingers curled into claws. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, all pretense of southern charm completely vanishing. "He is your father. He will die without that surgery. You cannot deny him medical care out of spite. It is illegal. I will go to the press. I will tell everyone how the new CEO of Sterling Medical treats her own sick father." I looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. "You are welcome to call any news station in Atlanta, Vanessa. But I highly doubt they will care about a woman who is currently under federal investigation for embezzlement and fraud. Besides, I am not denying him anything. He simply cannot afford the bill. And as I told you in the restaurant, I do not fund strangers." Calvin reached a shaking hand out toward me. "Chloe, please," he begged, tears actually welling up in his eyes. "I will do anything. I will publicly apologize. I will leave Vanessa. Just please do not take this away from me. My heart is failing." "High as a man who left a bleeding child in a thunderstorm," I said, looking directly at Vanessa, refusing to acknowledge his pitiful bargaining. "And I can do whatever I want because I own the building. I own the surgical suite. I signed the paychecks for the specialist who is supposed to crack his chest open tomorrow." I turned around and signaled to my driver, who immediately stepped out and opened the rear door of my town car. The plush leather interior waited for me, a sanctuary of power and peace that I had built with my own two hands. I looked back at them one last time. They were completely ruined, stripped of their leverage, their pride, and their future. They were exactly where they deserved to be. "Good luck finding a bed tomorrow, Calvin," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality over the quiet parking lot. Because my hospital turns no one away, except the man who told me to never come back. I slid into the back seat of the car. The heavy reinforced door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly muting the sound of Vanessa starting to scream and Calvin gasping for breath in the humid night air. The engine purred to life with smooth precision. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, I looked straight ahead. I did not watch them fade away in the rearview mirror. I left them stranded in the dark, exactly where they belonged. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive suite on the 50th floor of the Sterling Medical Holdings Tower. The view of the Atlanta skyline was breathtaking, but I was not looking at the city. I was looking at the final acquisition documents for the venture capital firm I had just purchased out from under my arrogant brother-in-law. The solid mahogany desk beneath my hands used to belong to Serena Sterling. Sitting in her chair, I felt the familiar hum of absolute control. The adrenaline from leaving my biological father and his toxic wife stranded in that restaurant parking lot had settled into a deep, profound sense of focus. I knew the war was not over. Desperate people do not surrender quietly, they lash out. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, relishing the quiet power of my office. That peace was violently shattered exactly 10 minutes later. My desk intercom buzzed frantically. It was my executive assistant, David, his voice tight with alarm. "Ms. Williams, I am so sorry, but there is a man out here demanding to see you. He is refusing to wait for security, and he is getting aggressive." Before I could even press the button to respond, the heavy double doors of my office burst open. They slammed against the wall stops with a sound like a gunshot. Connor marched into my sanctuary. The golden boy of Atlanta high society looked entirely different in the harsh morning light. His custom-tailored Italian suit was wrinkled. His tie was slightly crooked, and a sheen of frantic sweat coated his forehead. He was breathing heavily, operating on pure panicked adrenaline. Flanking him were two men clutching thick leather briefcases, looking incredibly uncomfortable as they surveyed the sheer scale of my office. They were corporate lawyers, no doubt dragged out of bed to execute whatever desperate plan Connor had concocted overnight. "Get out," Connor barked, turning to glare at David, who had rushed in right behind him. David, a former military police officer, immediately stepped forward, reaching for Connor's shoulder. "I will have security escort him to the lobby, Ms. Williams." I raised my hand, a single silent gesture that stopped David in his tracks. I placed my coffee cup carefully on its saucer, ensuring there was not a single tremor in my fingers. "It is fine, David," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "You can return to your desk. Shut the doors behind you, please. Let us see what has Connor so worked up this early in the morning." David nodded briskly and stepped out, pulling the heavy doors shut. The click of the latch echoed in the massive room. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them a seat. I simply watched the three men from across the expanse of my desk, letting the silence stretch out until the awkwardness became a physical weight in the room. Connor broke first. He stomped across the plush carpet and slammed both of his hands flat onto the polished surface of my desk, leaning forward to try and intimidate me with his physical presence. It was a classic aggressive negotiation tactic used by men who assumed their mere existence was enough to terrify a black woman into submission. "Did you really think a cheap stunt with a credit card was going to scare me away?" Connor spat, his voice echoing in the large space. "You think because you manipulated a dying old woman into leaving you her company that you suddenly know how to play with the big boys? You are a fluke, Chloe. You are a diversity hire who hit the jackpot, and you are way out of your depth." I did not blink. I did not shift my gaze. I just looked at his sweating face and waited for him to finish his tantrum. Serena had taught me that men like Connor hate silence. They despise an audience that does not react to their bluster. When you give them nothing, they always give you everything. Connor pushed away from the desk, his face flushing a mottled angry red at my lack of reaction. He snapped his fingers at the two lawyers standing nervously near the door. "Put the papers on the desk," he ordered them. One of the lawyers stepped forward hesitantly, sliding a thick stack of legal documents bound in a blue folder across the smooth mahogany surface. I did not reach for them. I just looked from the papers back up to Connor. "And what exactly is this?" I asked, my tone reflecting absolute boredom. "That is your reality check," Connor sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to regain his posture of superiority. "You think you bought a controlling stake in my firm yesterday. You think you can just swoop in and terminate me from a company I built from the ground up. Well, my legal team spent the entire night drafting an emergency injunction. We are filing a massive civil lawsuit against you and Sterling Medical Holdings for fraudulent acquisition practices and hostile corporate espionage." I let out a soft breath that sounded almost like a sigh. Connor was completely unhinged. He was throwing corporate buzzwords around, hoping they would sound intimidating to a woman he still fundamentally viewed as a teenage dropout. "We are going to freeze those shares immediately." Connor continued pacing in front of my desk, pointing a finger at me. And I know exactly what is happening behind the scenes here, Chloe. I know you are in the final stages of a massive merger with a European pharmaceutical network. That deal is worth billions. But European investors are incredibly risk-averse. The second they see Sterling Medical tied up in a messy high-profile fraud lawsuit involving frozen assets and executive misconduct, they will pull their funding. Your shiny new hospital empire will lose its biggest expansion opportunity. I will freeze your assets so fast your head will spin and your board of directors will throw you out on the street. The two lawyers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the legal grounds for this injunction were completely baseless and entirely built on Connor's bruised ego. But Connor was completely blind to his own delusion. He believed his white privilege and his aggressive posturing would force me to fold. "So what is your proposal, Connor?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "I assume you did not barge into my office just to announce a lawsuit. You came here to extort me." "It is not extortion, it is a settlement," Connor said, a smug, triumphant smile returning to his face. He leaned over the desk again, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial tone. "You are going to sign a document releasing your controlling shares back to me. You are going to immediately wire $250,000 to Calvin's surgeon to cover his medical bill. You are going to formally apologize to my wife and your family for your disgusting behavior last night. And finally, you are going to transfer 20% of your personal equity in Sterling Medical into a blind trust that I manage." I raised one eyebrow, staring at him in genuine disbelief. 20% of my hospital network. Consider it a consulting fee. Connor mocked, his confidence fully restored. Consider it a lesson in real wealth management. You do not understand how this world works, Chloe. You came from nothing. You scrubbed floors. You belong in an administrative cubicle taking orders, not sitting in the executive chair making decisions you cannot comprehend. You sign these papers and I make the lawsuit disappear. Your European merger goes through smoothly, and you get to keep playing boss. If you refuse, I drag you through the mud and I destroy everything that old woman gave you. He tapped his knuckles twice on the stack of legal documents, a gesture of absolute finality. I sat in my chair completely still. I analyzed the man standing in front of me. I saw the slight tremor in his hands. I saw the desperate darting of his eyes. He was not a shark circling a prey. He was a drowning man thrashing in the water, trying to drag anyone else down with him to stay afloat. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and I had shattered it with a single transaction. Now he was committing multiple felonies just to reassert his dominance. I finally moved. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk. I did not look at Connor. Instead, I shifted my gaze to the two lawyers who were practically sweating through their suits. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice sharp and clinical, cutting through the room like a scalpel. "I sincerely hope Connor is paying you an exorbitant retainer fee, because as officers of the court, you are currently standing in my office participating in documented felony extortion. I am sure the Georgia Bar Association will be incredibly interested to hear how you helped a desperate man attempt to blackmail the CEO of the largest healthcare network in the state." The lawyer closest to the door actually took a step backward, his eyes widening in alarm. "Ms. Williams, we were only retained to draft the injunction. We are not a party to any personal demands." "Shut up," Connor snapped at his own legal counsel, turning back to me with pure venom in his eyes. "Do not try to intimidate them. You are cornered, Chloe. Sign the papers or I burn your company to the ground." I slowly turned my attention back to Connor. I reached out and tapped the glass surface of my desk right next to the blue legal folder he had brought. "You think I bought your firm to humiliate you, Connor?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You think I spent millions of dollars acquiring your company just to fire you because you insulted me at a steakhouse? You really think I am that petty and impulsive?" Connor frowned, his smug expression faltering. "I have been tracking your firm for 6 months," I said smoothly. "Serena and I planned this acquisition long before she passed away. We did not just buy your venture capital firm, Connor. We audited it. We audited every single account, every offshore transfer, every shadow LLC you set up in the Cayman Islands." Connor's face went completely slack. The angry red flush vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying ashen gray. I reached toward the corner of my desk, where a single bright red file folder sat perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood. I rested my hand flat on top of it, looking up at the man who had just threatened to destroy my life. I slid the bright red folder across the smooth mahogany surface. It stopped right next to his ridiculous blue legal file. I flipped the cover open, revealing pages of highlighted bank statements, wire transfer logs, and internal communications that my forensic accounting team had spent the last 48 hours verifying. "You are a very sloppy thief, Connor," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the vast office. "Did you really believe no one would notice the capital bleeding out of the Series B funding rounds for your tech startups? You funneled over $12 million of your clients' money into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. A corporation that conveniently pays the mortgage on your Buckhead estate and covers the massive credit card bills your wife racks up in Paris and Milan." Connor opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked like all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. The two corporate lawyers standing behind him exchanged a single terrified glance. They immediately took 2 large steps backward, physically distancing themselves from the man who had just hired them. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. I picked up a specific document from the folder and held it up. "This is a wire transfer for $400,000 authorized by your personal security token just last week. The memo line claims it was for offshore software development, but the receiving account belongs to a luxury car dealership. You bought Maya a new G-Wagon with stolen investor funds while threatening to lay off your own analysts. That is fabricated." Connor finally choked out his voice, high-pitched and reedy. "You manufactured this evidence. You cannot prove any of it." "I do not have to prove it to you," I replied, resting back in my chair. "I only had to prove it to the federal authorities." Connor's eyes darted toward the heavy office doors. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his pale cheek. "What did you do?" he whispered. I pressed a button on my desk console. "David," I called out softly, "you can send our guests in now." The double doors opened immediately. It was not my personal security team that walked into the room. It was 3 agents wearing dark suits and serious expressions holding federal warrants. The lead agent stepped forward, flashing a badge that caught the morning sunlight. "Connor Williams," the agent said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of the law. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Connor stumbled backward, hitting the edge of my desk. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation that completely erased the arrogant venture capitalist who had stormed in here 10 minutes ago. "Chloe, please," he begged, holding his hands up. "We are family. Maya is your sister. You cannot do this. I will give you the firm. I will sign whatever you want. Please do not let them take me." I looked at him with absolute zero sympathy. "I told you at the restaurant," I said quietly. "A piece of plastic will not save you from your new boss. And neither will begging. Take him out of my office." The agents moved in swiftly, grabbing his arms and securing the steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click was the most satisfying sound I had heard all morning. Connor tried to struggle, but they hauled him toward the doors, his expensive Italian shoes dragging across the carpet. His 2 lawyers had already slipped out quietly, vanishing into the hallway to save their own careers. I watched the doors close behind them, taking the garbage out of my sanctuary. I closed the red folder and took another sip of my coffee. It was barely 9 in the morning, and the first domino had officially fallen. But I knew the shockwave of his arrest would reach my stepmother and stepsister within the hour. The real storm was just gathering off the coast. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom of Sterling Medical Holdings was entirely focused on the future. I sat at the head of a massive oval glass table, presiding over a meeting with the hospital network's board of directors. There were 12 individuals in the room, some of the most influential physicians, administrators, and financial directors in the American South. We were finalizing the details of the European merger that Connor had foolishly thought he could derail. I was in the middle of explaining our projected quarterly expansion when a sudden loud commotion erupted out in the hallway. Voices were raised in a frantic, escalating argument. I heard the distinct sound of someone shouting, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting a wall. The board members exchanged confused and alarmed glances. The chief of surgery started to stand up just as the boardroom doors were violently thrown open. Maya burst into the room. She looked completely unhinged. Her designer hair was a mess, her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her eyes were wild with a frantic, hysterical energy. Two security guards rushed in right behind her, reaching for her arms, but I raised my hand, signaling them to stop. "Let her go," I commanded. My voice was calm, projecting absolute control in front of my board. Maya shrugged off the guards and marched toward the glass table. She was breathing heavily, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. She was putting on a theatrical performance, weaponizing her tears, hoping to manipulate the room filled with powerful executives. "You ruined my life!" Maya screamed, her voice echoing off the acoustic panels of the boardroom. "You vindictive, jealous monster. You set my husband up." The board members shifted uncomfortably, murmuring to one another. They were highly respected professionals, unaccustomed to such raw, unhinged emotional outbursts during executive meetings. Ms. Williams, one of the senior directors, asked tentatively, "Should we adjourn and call the police?" "No," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my stepsister. "Maya is just leaving. She seems to be lost." "I am not going anywhere," Maya shrieked, slamming her hands on the table, just like her husband had done hours earlier. "I want everyone in this room to know exactly who you are." She turned to address the stunned board members, gesturing wildly toward me. "She is a fraud. She framed my husband for embezzlement because she has been jealous of me her entire life. She is an unstable, violent orphan who conned Dr. Sterling into giving her this company." I sat perfectly still. I did not interrupt her. I let her dig her grave as deep as she wanted. "She attacked my mother when she was 16. Maya cried, forcing huge, heavy tears to roll down her cheeks. She was out of her mind and threw herself into a glass table to frame us. My father had to kick her out to protect us from her psychotic episodes. And now she is using Dr. Sterling's money to destroy my family. Connor is innocent. She planted those financial records. She bought his firm just to frame him and send him to federal prison because she could never find a man of her own." Maya paused, gasping for breath, wiping the tears from her face, looking around the room to see if her performance was landing. A few board members looked visibly disturbed by her accusations, casting uncertain glances in my direction. The silence in the room was heavy, pregnant with the accusation that I was a corporate tyrant, using hospital funds for a personal vendetta. I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket and walked toward the control panel at the center of the table. "Are you quite finished, Maya?" I asked. My voice was gentle, almost conversational, which seemed to unnerve her more than if I had screamed back. "You are going to prison, Chloe." She spat, her chest heaving. "My lawyers are going to tear you apart. We are going to expose everything you have done." I nodded slowly. I pressed a single button on the control panel. The massive digital projection screen at the front of the boardroom hummed to life. The lights in the room dimmed automatically. "I am so glad you brought up exposure, Maya," I said, turning to face the screen. "Because while my forensic accounting team was looking into your husband's offshore accounts, we found something incredibly interesting. Something that requires the attention of this entire board, considering the philanthropic reputation of this hospital network." The screen illuminated, displaying high-resolution scans of bank records, wire transfers, and signed authorization forms. I watched Maya's face as her eyes tracked the projected images. The arrogant fury evaporated from her expression, replaced instantly by a hollow, creeping terror. "These are joint banking statements, belonging to you and your mother, Vanessa," I explained, my voice projecting clearly to every executive in the room. "And these documents show a direct pipeline of funds flowing from Connor's dummy corporations straight into an account registered to a non-profit charity. A charity that operates out of your local megachurch. A charity that Vanessa currently chairs." Maya took a staggering step backward. Her hands began to shake just as wildly as her voice had moments ago. "Where did you get those?" she whispered. I ignored her question, addressing the board members, who were now leaning and scrutinizing the financial documents displayed on the screen. "Connor was not acting alone," I stated firmly. Maya and Vanessa knew exactly where that stolen venture capital money was coming from, and they were actively laundering millions of dollars through fake charitable donations under the guise of community outreach. They used the church to wash the stolen funds clean before transferring the money back into their own private trust, staring at the screen in pure disgust. They were using a church charity to launder stolen money, the CFO asked, appalled. Yes, I confirmed. And since Sterling Medical Holdings is one of the largest corporate donors to that specific church, I felt it was my fiduciary duty to investigate where our philanthropic contributions were actually going. It turns out our donations were sharing a bank account with Connor's embezzled funds. Maya was completely trapped. The theatrical tears had dried up, leaving behind the stark reality of a woman who had just been caught participating in a massive federal crime. Her pristine socialite image, the flawless facade she had cultivated for her entire life, was shattering in real time in front of Atlanta's most elite medical professionals. You cannot prove we knew where the money came from, Maya stammered, her voice barely a squeak. My mother and I just managed the charity. I pressed another button on the console. An audio file began to play over the boardroom speakers. It was a recorded voicemail clearly capturing Maya's voice. Connor, you need to move the next $400,000 through Mom's church account by Tuesday. Maya's recorded voice echoed in the silent room. The dealership needs the wire transfer cleared before I can pick up the G-Wagon, and Mom wants her cut for managing the tax write-off. Do not mess this up. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at Maya, who was now hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the room looking for an exit. The FBI already has these files, Maya. I said, my voice lacking any trace of sympathy. They are reviewing them right now while your husband sits in a holding cell. I suggest you leave my hospital and call a very good criminal defense attorney, because by tomorrow morning you and Vanessa are going to need one. Security, I called out, nodding to the guards who had remained stationed by the doors. Please escort this woman off the premises. If she resists, you have my authorization to restrain her and contact the local authorities for trespassing. The guards moved in quickly, grabbing Maya by the arms. She did not fight them. She was completely broken, paralyzed by the realization that her life of luxury was entirely over. They dragged her out of the boardroom, the heavy wooden doors sealing shut behind her. I turned back to my board of directors, projecting a calm, reassuring smile. I pressed a button to turn off the screen and bring the lights back up to full brightness. I apologize for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen, I said smoothly, returning to my seat at the head of the table. Now if we could return to page 4 of the European Merger Prospectus. The board members rustled their papers. The chief financial officer cleared his throat, attempting to restore the professional decorum that Sterling Medical Holdings was known for. But the quiet hum of the air conditioning was suddenly shattered by a violent crash just outside the secondary doors. The heavy oak panels burst open with such force that they struck the acoustic walls. Maya had not left this building. She had somehow broken away from the security escort in the elevator lobby, slipping through the executive catering pantry to circle back. She stumbled into the boardroom, her designer dress caught and torn at the hem, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. 2 security guards rushed in right behind her, one of them pressing a hand to a bleeding scratch on his cheek. Ms. Williams, the guard panted, looking incredibly apologetic. She bit me. The older, affluent physicians and hospital administrators sitting around the massive glass table shrank back in their ergonomic chairs. This was a room of elite medical professionals and venture capitalists. They were entirely unaccustomed to physical violence infiltrating their high-level meetings. I raised a single hand, bringing the security guards to a halt. It is fine, I said, my voice projecting a cool, unwavering authority. Let her speak. Let us see exactly what kind of performance she has prepared for our distinguished board. Maya did not scream this time. She realized that rage had failed her, so she instantly pivoted to the only other weapon she had ever successfully wielded. She played the victim. She collapsed to her knees right in the center of the plush boardroom carpet. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, theatrical sob. When she looked up, her mascara was running down her cheeks, and she fixed her tear-filled eyes directly on Dr. Harrison, the conservative chairman of the board. Please, you have to listen to me. Maya wept, her voice shaking with manufactured heartbreak. You cannot let her do this. You do not know who she really is. Chloe is not a stable person. She is a vindictive, deeply disturbed woman who has been trying to destroy my family for 19 years. Dr. Harrison frowned, exchanging a very uncomfortable glance with the chief financial officer. The European merger we were discussing was worth billions. Any hint of executive instability was a massive liability. Maya knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to poison the well. She framed my husband. Maya continued crawling a few inches forward on the carpet, looking up at the executives like a desperate martyr. Connor is a good man. He is an honest venture capitalist. Chloe manufactured those financial records. She planted that evidence because she has been obsessed with him for years. She has been insanely jealous of my marriage, my life, and my happiness because she grew up with nothing. I remained perfectly still in my chair at the head of the table. I did not interrupt her. I simply watched her weave a web of absolute lies, marveling at how easily deception flowed from her lips. It was the exact same talent her mother Vanessa possessed. "Ask my father," Maya pleaded, turning her tear-streaked face to the rest of the board. "Ask Calvin." When Chloe was 16, she had a violent psychotic break. She attacked my mother in our living room. She was entirely out of her mind, screaming and breaking things. She threw herself into a glass table just to make it look like we hurt her. My father had to kick her out of the house to protect us. She has a documented history of violent delusions. The room went deathly silent. The weight of her accusations hung heavy in the air. A CEO with a hidden history of violent psychiatric episodes was a corporate nightmare. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Williams," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "these are incredibly serious allegations." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. I did not look at Dr. Harrison. I kept my eyes entirely locked on Maya, who was kneeling on the floor, clutching her torn designer dress, looking up at me with a glimmer of malicious triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the old stigma of the angry, unstable black woman would be enough to terrify a room full of conservative investors. "Notice, gentlemen," I began, my voice ringing with absolute crystalline clarity. "Notice what she is not saying. Notice how Maya is not denying the routing numbers on the bank statements I projected earlier. Notice how she is not denying that millions of dollars of stolen investor funds were laundered through a fake charity account registered to her mother's mega church. Notice how she is not denying the audio recording of her own voice authorizing the purchase of a luxury SUV using stolen money." Maya flinched, the fake tears suddenly freezing on her cheeks. When criminals are confronted with irrefutable paper trails. I continued pacing slowly down the length of the glass table. I addressed the board directly. They do not argue the facts. They assassinate the character of the person presenting the facts. Maya is attempting to paint me as an unstable, jealous orphan because it is the exact same lie her mother used to cover up her own financial crimes 19 years ago. "She is lying!" Maya shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You cannot trust her. She manipulated Dr. Sterling. She conned a dying billionaire into giving her this network. She should be suspended. You have to remove her pending a psychiatric evaluation." I reached the end of the table, stopping just a few feet away from where Maya knelt. I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure. Serena Sterling was the sharpest, most brilliant medical pioneer this state has ever seen, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. She did not hand me this empire out of pity. She tested me every single day. She taught me how to identify parasites who siphon resources and contribute absolutely nothing to society. Parasites like Connor. Parasites like you. I turned back to the digital console on the table. I pressed a sequence of buttons. The massive screen at the front of the boardroom illuminated once more. This time, it was not showing bank statements. It was showing the high-definition security footage from my office captured just hours earlier. The board watched in complete silence as the video played. The footage clearly showed Connor, flanked by his two panicked lawyers, storming into my office, threatening to derail the hospital's European merger if I did not pay Calvin's $250,000 medical bill and hand over 20% of my equity. The audio was crystal clear. Every arrogant slur, every corporate threat, and every single element of felony extortion was broadcast perfectly to the entire executive board. I paused the video right on Connor's sweating, desperate face. "That is the man you claim I am obsessed with, Maya," I said, gesturing to the screen. A panicked, sloppy thief who tried to blackmail a hospital network to cover his own embezzlement. Does he look like an honest venture capitalist to you? Or does he look like a man who knows he is going to federal prison? Maya stared at the frozen image of her husband. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The theatrical illusion was entirely broken. The board members shook their heads in absolute disgust. Dr. Harrison let out a heavy sigh, returning his gaze to his paperwork, completely dismissing Maya's existence. I am not the bleeding 16-year-old girl you can frame anymore, Maya, I said, stepping back toward my chair. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Medical Holdings. I own the building you are kneeling in. I own the security cameras that recorded your husband committing a felony. And I am the one who holds your entire future in the palm of my hand. I signaled to the security guards. Maya Williams is officially permanently banned from every property owned or operated by Sterling Medical Holdings worldwide, I instructed the guards. If she steps foot within 500 yards of our clinic's offices or hospital wings, you are to immediately have her arrested for criminal trespassing. Remove her, now. The guards did not hesitate. They stepped forward and grabbed Maya by her arms, hauling her off the plush carpet. She kicked and thrashed her designer heels, scraping against the floor, but the fight had completely left her. She did not scream any more accusations. She just sobbed real terrifying tears of absolute defeat. She knew it was over. Her wealth, her status, her marriage, and her freedom were all entirely gone. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind her, leaving the boardroom in profound silence. I walked back to the head of the table. I took a slow breath, centering myself, pushing the lingering adrenaline down. I looked around at the 12 influential executives who were staring at me with a mixture of deep respect and healthy fear. I apologize again for the theatrics, I said, smoothing my blazer and taking my seat. Family disputes can be unfortunately messy when financial fraud is exposed. But as you can see, my administration does not tolerate corruption on any level. Now, Dr. Harrison, I believe we were discussing the regulatory compliance protocols for the European merger on page 4. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, a small, appreciative smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yes, Ms. Williams, he said, his tone carrying absolute deference. Your handling of that situation was incredibly efficient. Let us proceed with page 4. The meeting continued smoothly for another 30 minutes. We finalized the merger deals, solidifying an international expansion that would double the net worth of Sterling Medical Holdings. I felt a deep, satisfying warmth in my chest. I had protected Serena's legacy. I had defended my own character, and I had completely dismantled the people who tried to destroy me. But just as Dr. Harrison moved to officially adjourn the meeting, the secondary doors to the boardroom opened once more. It was David, my executive assistant. He did not look panicked, but his expression was incredibly grave. He walked swiftly across the room, bypassing protocol, and leaned down next to my chair. Ms. Williams. David whispered, his voice low enough that the board could not hear. I am very sorry to interrupt the conclusion of the meeting, but we have a developing public relations situation. I frowned, keeping my expression neutral. What is it, David? It is your stepmother, Vanessa, he replied, handing me a sleek digital tablet. She has just called an emergency press conference on the steps of her mega church in downtown Atlanta. Every local news network is broadcasting it live right now, and she is holding up documents claiming that Dr. Serena Sterling was a thief. I took the tablet from his hands, staring at the live video feed. The final battle was not going to be fought in a boardroom. It was going to be fought in the public eye. I stood at the head of the boardroom table, holding the digital tablet David had just handed me. On the glowing screen, my stepmother Vanessa was standing on the pristine white steps of her massive church in downtown Atlanta, holding an emergency press conference. The local news tickers flashed across the bottom of the feed. But before I could even process Vanessa's desperate media stunt, a new commotion erupted out in the hallway. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open once again. This time it was 2 federal agents accompanied by our head of building security. They had arrived to officially take custody of Maya. I placed the tablet face down on the glass table. I looked at the 12 board members who were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They deserved a complete explanation regarding the woman who had just crashed our private meeting. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of panic. I simply reached for the digital control console and pressed a single button. The massive projection screen at the front of the room hummed to life. I bypassed the European merger documents and pulled up the encrypted files my forensic accounting team had finalized that morning. High-resolution images of joint bank statements appeared on the screen. The names at the top of the accounts were highlighted in bright yellow: Maya Williams and Vanessa Hayes. I paced slowly around the glass table, making sure every executive in the room had a clear view of the numbers. I told the board that Maya had just stood in this very room and played the victim. She had weaponized her tears and accused me of framing her husband out of jealousy. But the documents on the screen told the real story. I pointed to a series of massive deposits. Connor had embezzled millions of dollars from his venture capital clients, but he could not simply spend that stolen money without triggering federal red flags. He needed a washing machine, and his wife Maya provided the perfect cover. I walked the board through the exact anatomy of their crime. Maya and Vanessa had set up a fraudulent community outreach program through their highly influential megachurch. It was completely sickening. They used the guise of a charitable medical fund for underprivileged families to deposit Connor's stolen venture capital money. They washed the dirty funds through the church's tax-exempt accounts. Once the money was clean, Maya and Vanessa transferred it directly into their own private offshore trusts. I watched the faces of the board members as the reality set in. These were some of the most powerful physicians and investors in Atlanta. A few of them attended that exact same church. Their spouses served on philanthropic committees alongside Maya. They had attended her lavish galas and praised her charitable spirit. Now they were staring at absolute proof that Maya's pristine socialite image was nothing but a facade for a massive federal money laundering operation. The golden child of Atlanta society was a fraud who stole from her own community to fund her designer wardrobe and luxury vehicles. The chief financial officer shook his head in pure disgust. He asked if the authorities had this information. I nodded and informed him that my legal team had already forwarded the entire unredacted file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I excused myself from the boardroom and walked out into the executive lobby with the federal agents. We looked down over the glass balcony into the main hospital atrium. Maya was standing near the front security desk. Her torn designer dress dragged on the polished floor. The arrogant fire had completely left her body. She was sobbing hysterically as the local police officially handed her over to the federal agents. The main lobby was bustling with prominent doctors, wealthy donors, and hospital administrators. Everyone stopped to watch. Maya, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on people like me, was now being paraded through a public space in steel handcuffs. Her flawless reputation shattered into a million pieces in real time. The people she had spent years trying to impress were now pulling out their phones to record her arrest. She tried to hide her face behind her tangled hair, but there was no escaping the humiliation. She had built her life on a foundation of stolen money and cruelty, and now the entire structure had collapsed right on top of her. David walked up to the balcony and stood beside me. He watched Maya being shoved into the back of a dark federal vehicle right outside the hospital's revolving doors. He informed me that the agents had seized the financial projections and had everything they needed for a full federal indictment. Maya and Connor were going to spend a very long time in prison. I felt a deep, profound sense of justice. For 19 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been labeled the delinquent, the problem child, the outcast. Now the golden daughter was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, and I was standing on the executive balcony of the empire I owned. But my moment of peace was interrupted when David handed the digital tablet back to me. The screen was still playing the live broadcast from the downtown church. I looked down at the video feed. With Connor and Maya both in federal custody and Calvin's health rapidly failing, Vanessa was completely cornered. She had no money, no allies, and no leverage. Desperate people do not surrender when they are cornered. They lash out with everything they have left. Vanessa had orchestrated a massive smear campaign. She was standing at a podium, surrounded by sympathetic community members who had absolutely no idea she had been using their church to launder stolen money. She was wiping fake tears from her eyes, playing the role of a devoted wife fighting for her dying husband's life against a greedy, heartless corporate monster. But she was not just asking for sympathy. She pulled a piece of aged, yellowed paper from her folder and held it up for the news cameras. Vanessa claimed the document was a decades-old contract. She boldly told the reporters that Dr. Serena Sterling, the brilliant pioneer who built my hospital network, had actually stolen the initial patents for her medical empire from Calvin. It was an absolutely absurd lie. Calvin had never possessed the intellect or the ambition to invent a medical device. He was a man who could not even manage his own household finances without relying on his wife's stolen funds. Yet Vanessa stood on those church steps and painted me as a traitor who had conspired with a thief to steal my own father's legacy. She stared directly into the camera and demanded a $10 million settlement from Sterling Medical Holdings to make things right. She claimed she needed the money to pay for Calvin's heart surgery and to reclaim their family's stolen honor. She was trying to use the court of public opinion to extort me. She knew she could not beat me in a boardroom, so she was trying to destroy the hospital's reputation on live television. She thought her performance would back me into a corner. She thought I would pay her off quietly to avoid a public scandal. She calculated that the pressure of a media circus would force me to hand over the funds she needed to hire criminal defense attorneys for Maya and Connor. I locked the screen of the tablet and handed it back to David. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. Vanessa had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had dragged our private war out into the public eye, completely unaware of the weapon I had been keeping in my desk drawer for almost 2 decades. Serena Sterling had warned me that true power attracts parasites. She taught me to always keep my receipts. Vanessa thought she was dealing with a frightened daughter who would shrink under the spotlight. She was about to find out exactly what happens when you challenge a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Security escorts were taking Maya to a federal holding cell, and now it was time for me to go handle her mother. I turned away from the balcony and walked back toward my office to retrieve the one piece of evidence that would end this war forever. The heavy mahogany doors of my executive suite closed behind me, sealing off the chaotic noise of the hospital lobby. I walked across the plush carpet, my eyes fixed on the large portrait of Dr. Serena Sterling that hung on the far wall. She had commissioned that painting just a year before she passed away. In it, she sat tall and unyielding, a brilliant African-American pioneer who commanded absolute respect. She had taught me everything I knew about surviving in a world designed to crush us. She taught me that when a parasite tries to attach itself to your legacy, you do not just brush it off, you eradicate it completely. I reached behind the gilded frame of the portrait and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden in the wall panel. A soft green light confirmed my identity, and a small concealed safe clicked open. Inside, sitting on a shelf next to critical corporate contingency plans, was a small black velvet box. I pulled it out and opened the lid. Resting on the dark fabric was an old digital audio recorder. It was bulky and outdated, a relic from 19 years ago. But the audio file preserved on its internal hard drive was the most powerful weapon I owned. I slipped the recorder into the pocket of my blazer. Just as my office television flickered to life, David had routed the live news feed directly to my screen. I stood in the center of my office watching the local Atlanta news broadcast. The scene playing out on the television was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Vanessa was standing at a wooden podium on the front steps of our former megachurch in downtown Atlanta. The massive stone pillars of the church framed her perfectly, giving her an aura of divine righteousness. She had strategically dressed for the occasion, abandoning her usual designer brands and flashy jewelry. Instead, she wore a modest dark navy dress and minimal makeup. Her hair was pulled back, simply making her look like a tired, devoted housewife, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Behind her stood a crowd of sympathetic congregation members. They were good, honest people holding signs asking for prayers for Calvin. They had absolutely no idea that the woman standing at the podium had been using their tithes and community outreach accounts to launder stolen venture capital money. They were completely misinformed props in Vanessa's desperate theatrical production. Calvin was not standing beside her. He was currently lying in a pre-op bed at a different hospital, weak and terrified, his heart slowly giving out. Vanessa was using his absence to maximize the sympathy of the press corps gathered at the bottom of the church steps. My husband is fighting for his life right now. Vanessa wept into the cluster of microphones. She reached up to dab a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. He needs a complex heart bypass surgery by tomorrow morning, or he will not survive. And his own daughter, the chief executive officer of Sterling Medical Holdings, has completely refused to help him. The reporters shouted questions asking why a billionaire healthcare CEO would deny her own father medical treatment. Because Chloe is not just a heartless corporate executive. Vanessa sobbed, gripping the edges of the podium to steady herself. She is a traitor to her own blood. She is actively protecting a legacy of theft and corruption. I crossed my arms over my chest, watching her weave a web of absolute poison. Vanessa was backed into a corner. Her daughter Maya was in federal custody for money laundering. Her son-in-law Connor was facing years in prison for embezzlement. She knew the federal agents would be coming for her next. She had no money, no leverage, and no escape route. So she decided to burn the entire house down and try to extort me in the smoke. Vanessa reached into a leather folder resting on the podium. She pulled out a stack of aged yellowed papers, holding them up for the cameras to zoom in on. The documents looked old, authentic, and incredibly official. Sterling Medical Holdings was built on a lie. Vanessa declared, her voice ringing with manufactured righteous indignation. Dr. Serena Sterling did not invent the cardiovascular stent designs that launched her massive medical empire. My husband did. Calvin was a brilliant, innovative mind. He spent years developing those initial patents in our garage, trying to build a better life for his family. I actually let out a harsh, humorless laugh in the empty quiet of my office. It was the most absurd, brazen lie she could have possibly invented. Calvin had never possessed the intellect, the discipline, or the ambition to invent a medical device. He was a man who could not even manage his own household finances without relying on his wife's stolen funds. He was a coward who abandoned his bleeding teenage daughter in a rainstorm because dealing with her was too inconvenient. But to the hungry reporters standing on those church steps, the narrative was absolute gold. The evil corporate stepchild conspiring with a billionaire thief to steal her own father's legacy was a story that would dominate the national headlines for months. Dr. Serena Sterling stole these designs from my husband decades ago. Vanessa continued waving the forged papers in the air. She used her wealth and influence to crush him. She took his life's work, and she used it to become a billionaire. And when Chloe found out the truth, instead of standing by her father, she joined forces with the thief. Chloe turned her back on her own family for a taste of that stolen money. The crowd of church members gasped in collective horror. The reporters shouted even louder, asking to see the documents, asking if Calvin planned to sue. "My husband is too sick to fight a long legal battle," Vanessa cried, dropping her voice to a desperate, pleading pitch. "The federal government is already harassing my daughter and my son-in-law based on Chloe's fabricated corporate lies. We have nothing left. We are a family completely destroyed by a greedy, vindictive woman." She paused, looking directly into the primary news camera, locking eyes with the lens. I knew she was speaking directly to me. "We demand a $10 million settlement from Sterling Medical Holdings. By the end of the day," Vanessa stated, her voice hardening with an extortionist's threat. $10 million to pay for Calvin's life-saving surgery, to clear my family's name, and to compensate my husband for the patents that were violently stolen from him. If Chloe refuses to make this right, we will take this to federal court, and we will dismantle the entire Sterling network piece by piece. The live feed cut back to the news anchor, sitting at the studio desk, looking completely shocked by the allegations. I pressed the power button on the remote, turning the television off. The screen went completely black, plunging my office back into absolute silence. I stood there, analyzing the situation with the clinical precision Serena had spent years instilling in me. Vanessa's forgery was impressive. She had likely paid a desperate graphic designer a small fortune to fabricate those decades-old patent documents. She was calculating that the mere threat of a massive intellectual property scandal would panic my board of directors. She assumed I would authorize a $10 million payout just to quietly sweep the public relations nightmare under the rug. She thought the pressure of a media circus would force me to hand over the funds she desperately needed to hire elite criminal defense attorneys for Maya and Connor, and to buy her own ticket out of the country before the federal agents realized she was the mastermind behind the church laundering scheme. She was playing chess, but she did not realize I had already flipped the entire board. I reached into my pocket and ran my thumb over the cold, hard plastic of the digital audio recorder. 19 years ago, Serena Sterling did not just pick me up off the concrete and pay for my education. She walked into that emergency room and saw a 16-year-old girl who had been physically assaulted and abandoned. She knew that without proof, my word would always be weighed against the lies of two wealthy adults. So she quietly slipped a digital recorder into her coat pocket before confronting the medical staff. She had captured everything. I turned around and walked out of my executive suite. David was waiting for me in the lobby, his face tight with concern as he held a stack of urgent messages from the Public Relations Department. Mrs. Williams, David said, falling into step beside me as I walked toward the private elevator banks. The communications team is requesting an immediate lockdown. They want to issue a standard corporate denial and restrict all press access to the hospital grounds. They are advising you to remain in the building until the legal department can draft a cease and desist order regarding the forged patents. Tell the communications team to stand down, David I instructed, pressing the call button for the ground floor. Do not issue a single statement. Do not restrict press access. In fact, I want you to call the security desk and tell them to allow the media vans to park directly in front of the main hospital entrance. David blinked, his professional composure faltering for a fraction of a second. You want to invite the press to the hospital. Vanessa wants a public settlement, I said, stepping into the elevator cab as the brass doors slid open. I am going to give her exactly what she asked for. I want every single camera in Atlanta pointed directly at me when I hand it to her. Have my car waiting at the front curb, David. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed, sealing me inside the descending elevator, the quiet hum of the machinery matching the steady, relentless beating of my heart. Vanessa had built a house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies. She thought she could burn down my empire to save herself. I was going to let her light the match, and then I was going to lock the doors and watch her burn inside. The elevator ride down from the 50th floor took exactly 42 seconds. I spent every single one of those seconds standing perfectly still, listening to the quiet hum of the steel cables lowering me toward the ground. I kept my right hand tucked neatly into the pocket of my blazer, resting my fingertips against the cold, hard plastic of the old digital audio recorder. I traced the edge of the device, letting the physical reality of it ground me. For 19 years, this piece of technology had sat in a hidden safe, a silent witness waiting for the exact moment it would be needed. That moment had finally arrived. The brass doors slid open, revealing the expansive marble lobby of the Sterling Medical Headquarters. The space was usually a sanctuary of quiet efficiency, filled with soft natural light and the gentle murmur of professional staff. Today it looked like a fortress bracing for a siege. My head of building security was standing by the reception desk, flanked by a dozen uniformed guards. He looked incredibly tense, holding a two-way radio and staring out through the towering glass walls that separated the lobby from the main plaza. Mrs. Williams, the security chief said, rushing over as soon as I stepped out of the elevator. The situation outside is escalating rapidly. The crowd from the church marched straight over here. They have completely blocked the front plaza. The Atlanta police are setting up barricades to keep them off the steps, but the press corps is getting incredibly aggressive. I have a secure vehicle waiting in the underground loading dock. We can get you out through the service tunnels completely undetected. I looked past him through the reinforced glass of the lobby doors. The scene outside was pure, concentrated chaos. News vans from every major local and national network were parked haphazardly along the curb, their satellite dishes raised toward the sky. Reporters were pressed tightly against the security barricades, holding microphones and cameras like weapons. Behind them, a massive crowd of misinformed community members held up makeshift cardboard signs demanding justice for Calvin and calling me a corporate thief. I am not leaving through a service tunnel, I said, my voice projecting a cool, unwavering authority. Cancel the vehicle in the loading dock. Tell your guards to unlock the main front doors and step aside. The security chief blinked, his professional composure faltering for a brief second. Ma'am, with all due respect, walking out there right now is walking directly into an ambush. They are looking for a reaction. They want to catch you off guard on live television. I know exactly what they want. I replied, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit. And I am going to give them a performance they will never forget. Unlock the doors. The chief nodded sharply, recognizing that there was absolutely no room for debate. He signaled his team and the guards stepped back from the entrance. I walked across the polished marble floor, the sharp rhythmic click of my heels echoing in the cavernous lobby. I did not hesitate. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the blazing heat of the Atlanta afternoon. The reaction was instantaneous and deafening. The moment the sunlight caught my face, the crowd erupted. A wall of blinding flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, turning the plaza into a strobe-lit nightmare. Reporters surged forward, pressing their weight against the metal barricades, shoving dozens of microphones toward my face. The noise was a physical force, a chaotic wave of shouted questions and angry accusations. Ms. Williams, is it true you conspired to steal your father's medical patents? Are you denying a dying man the funds for his life-saving surgery? How do you respond to the allegations of corporate theft? Are you stepping down as the CEO of Sterling Medical Holdings? I stood at the top of the concrete steps, looking down at the sea of frantic faces. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my chin raised, my expression entirely unbothered. I did not raise my hands to shield my eyes from the flashes. I did not flinch at the shouting. I stood on the steps of my empire and looked at them with the calm, clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a minor infection. Then the crowd parted. Vanessa pushed her way through the front of the barricade, escorted by two large men from her congregation. She had abandoned the wooden podium at the church to bring the war directly to my front door. She stumbled up the first few steps, making sure every single camera lens was focused squarely on her face. She looked like a woman entirely consumed by tragic grief. She clutched a crumpled tissue in one hand and the forged yellow documents in the other. Her dark navy dress looked intentionally plain, a stark contrast to my immaculate executive suit. She had calculated every single visual element of this confrontation to highlight the narrative of the poor, desperate housewife fighting against the wealthy, heartless corporate monster. Chloe Vanessa wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. She stopped just a few feet away from me, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. How can you stand there? How can you show your face after what you have done to your own blood? The cameras immediately swiveled, locking onto her, capturing every exaggerated tear rolling down her cheek. Your father is lying in a hospital bed right now, Vanessa cried out, ensuring her voice carried over the ambient noise of the city street. His heart is failing, he is terrified and in pain. And the daughter he raised, the daughter he loved and protected, is standing on the steps of a billion-dollar hospital network, refusing to pay for his care. I did not interrupt her. I let her speak. I knew that the more she talked, the deeper the grave she dug for herself would become. You stole from him, Vanessa screamed, turning slightly so her profile was perfectly framed for the news crews. You and Serena Sterling. You took the brilliant designs he built in our garage. You took his cardiovascular patents and you used them to build this entire empire. You owe him his life. You owe us the $10 million settlement to make this right. I looked at Vanessa, taking a slow, deliberate breath. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. To the reporters watching, she was a devastated victim fighting for her husband's legacy. But I could see the truth hiding just beneath the surface of her fake tears. I saw the desperate, frantic darting of her eyes. I saw the white-knuckled grip she had on those forged papers. She was terrified. She knew Maya was sitting in a federal holding cell. She knew Connor's financial accounts were seized. She knew the federal agents were closing in on her church laundering scheme. This $10 million extortion attempt was her only remaining ticket out of the country. She was betting everything on the assumption that a black female CEO would be too terrified of a public relations disaster to fight back. She assumed I would authorize a massive payout just to make the cameras go away. Look at her, Vanessa sobbed, turning back to the reporters, pointing at me again. Look at how cold she is. She does not care about her family. She only cares about her stolen money. Step down, Chloe. Step down as CEO and return the funds you and that thief took from my husband. The reporters shouted again, asking for my response, demanding a statement on the $10 million lawsuit. I waited. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment until the crowd realized I was preparing to speak. The shouting slowly died down. The reporters leaned forward, pushing their digital recorders and microphones closer, straining to catch my words. I looked out over the sea of cameras, and then I looked directly at the woman who had tried to destroy me 19 years ago. Vanessa, I began, my voice ringing with a cold, piercing clarity that easily carried across the entire plaza. You are demanding $10 million for cardiovascular patents you claim Calvin invented in your garage. You claim he is a brilliant medical innovator whose legacy was violently stolen. I took a slow, measured step down, bringing myself closer to her. Let me ask you a very simple question, Vanessa. I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous, unyielding timbre. Does a brilliant medical innovator spend the last 2 decades asking his wife to balance his basic checking account? Because the Calvin I know, the man who abandoned his bleeding daughter in a thunderstorm, is a man who could not successfully navigate a high school biology textbook, let alone design complex surgical robotics. Vanessa flinched, the fake tears freezing on her face. She gripped the forged papers tighter, crumpling the edges. Do not try to insult his intelligence to cover up your crimes. She snapped, her voice losing some of its theatrical grief and replacing it with genuine panic. I have the documents right here. I have the proof. I smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression that caused the reporter closest to me to actually take a step back. You do not have proof, Vanessa, I replied, shaking my head slowly. You have a very expensive piece of forgery created by a desperate woman who knows the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently auditing her fake church charities. The crowd of church members standing behind the barricades gasped audibly. The reporters immediately began whispering to one another, realizing the narrative had just violently shifted directions. You are trying to extort this hospital network, I continued, my voice rising in power and command. You orchestrated this entire media circus because your daughter Maya and your son-in-law Connor are currently facing federal indictments for embezzlement and money laundering. You need $10 million to pay for criminal defense attorneys and to flee the state before the authorities put you in handcuffs for orchestrating the entire scheme. That is a lie! Vanessa shrieked, her entire body trembling with rage. She dropped the grieving wife act entirely, her true vicious nature bleeding through the cracks in her facade. You are an unstable, violent liar. You are a vindictive little brat who has been trying to destroy this family since you were a teenager. Vanessa took a step forward, pointing the forged documents directly at my face. You belong in a psychiatric ward. Chloe, she screamed, her voice echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers. You have a documented history of psychotic breaks. You attacked me in my own living room 19 years ago. You threw yourself into a glass table just to frame me. You are a dangerous, pathological liar, and no one here is going to believe a single word you say over the proof I am holding in my hands. The trap was fully set. She had walked directly into it, completely blinded by her own arrogance and desperation. She had just publicly accused me of the exact same lie she used to cover up her assault nearly 2 decades ago. She had just cemented her narrative on live television. I reached my hand into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers wrapped securely around the solid casing of the old digital audio recorder. I did not break eye contact with Vanessa as I pulled the device out and held it up for every single camera in the plaza to see. I held the bulky black plastic device high enough for the sunlight to catch its scratched surface. The barrage of camera flashes illuminated the old digital audio recorder, turning it into the focal point of the entire plaza. The reporters, who had been shouting aggressive questions just seconds ago, suddenly fell into a strained, expectant silence. They did not know what I was holding, but they could sense the absolute lethal confidence radiating from my posture. Vanessa stared at this device. Her perfectly practiced expression of maternal grief wavered, fracturing at the edges. She did not recognize the object right away. How could she? It was a relic from a night she thought she had successfully buried almost 2 decades ago. But as I lowered the recorder and stepped directly toward the cluster of microphones waiting on the barricade, a creeping shadow of dread began to crawl across her face. I tapped the central microphone to ensure the audio feed was live. The sharp thud echoed through the public address system, cutting through the muggy Atlanta air. I looked directly into the primary news camera, and then shifted my gaze back to Vanessa. You just told the world that I am a pathological liar. I began, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. You stood on the steps of a church this morning and claimed that my father was a brilliant inventor who was robbed by a billionaire. You just screamed in front of these cameras that I had a psychotic break at 16 and threw myself into a glass table to frame you. Vanessa swallowed hard, her throat visibly working, but she jutted her chin out, doubling down on her delusion. Because it is the truth. She snapped, her voice trembling slightly as she gripped the metal barricade. You are sick, Chloe. You have always been sick. You are trying to distract everyone from the fact that you and Serena Sterling stole my husband's legacy. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion filled with absolute pity. Serena Sterling did not steal anything from your husband, Vanessa. In fact, she gave him something he never deserved. She gave him a free pass. When she found me bleeding in that emergency room 19 years ago, she knew exactly what kind of people you and Calvin were. She was a black woman who had fought her way to the top of the medical establishment. She knew that the world would always demand indisputable proof when a wealthy family accused a black teenager of being violent and unstable. She knew that my truth would be buried under your privilege and your perfectly manicured lies. I held the black device up to the microphones. So before she walked into my trauma bay that night, Serena quietly slipped this dictation recorder into the pocket of her wool coat. She walked down the hospital corridor and stood just outside the emergency room doctor's lounge. She pressed record, and she captured a conversation that she locked inside a biometric safe for 19 years. She told me to only use it if the parasites ever came back to try and drain my blood. The color drained from Vanessa's face so fast she looked like a ghost. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as her brain finally connected the timeline. The night I was injured, the hospital, the missing medical reports. No, she gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hands flying up as if she could physically block the sound waves from leaving the device. You cannot play that. That is illegal. That is a fabricated recording. If it is fabricated, then you have absolutely nothing to worry about. I replied, my thumb resting over the faded green play button. I pressed it down, holding the device directly against the primary microphone. The massive outdoor speakers crackled with a burst of 19-year-old static, followed by the distinct ambient sounds of a busy emergency room. Then a voice filled the plaza. It was younger, higher-pitched, but undeniably, absolutely Vanessa. Listen to me, doctor. I am willing to be very generous here. The recorded voice of Vanessa echoed across the concrete steps. My husband is a prominent businessman. We cannot have a police report stating there was a physical altercation in our home. It would ruin his reputation. The girl is troubled. She is deeply disturbed. A second voice, a male physician, sounded hesitant over the recording. Ma'am, she has a severe concussion and defensive bruising on her wrists. This does not look like a simple fall. I am mandated by state law to report suspected domestic assault involving a minor. I have $10,000 in cash in my purse right now. The recorded. Vanessa fired back, dripping with urgent, venomous manipulation. And I will write a check for another $40,000 to whatever private clinic you want tomorrow morning. Nobody cares about a troubled teenager from a broken home. You write on that chart that her injuries were self-inflicted during a manic episode. You write that she threw herself into that glass table. Do not ruin my family over a street kid who does not know her place. I clicked the button, stopping the playback. The heavy, thick silence that descended on the plaza was absolute. The reporters stopped shouting. The church members who had marched down the street to support their devoted charity leader dropped their handmade signs. The sheer, undeniable reality of the extortion and the bribery hung in the air, a toxic cloud that Vanessa could not wave away. Vanessa lunged forward, her manicured hands grasping desperately at the metal barricades, trying to reach the podium to snatch the device from my hands. My security team immediately stepped in, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits between her frantic, grasping fingers and my position on the stairs. She was completely powerless. I lowered the recorder, putting it safely back into the pocket of my blazer. I looked out at the stunned, silent crowd of journalists. That recording has already been authenticated by federal forensic audio experts, I announced, ensuring every single camera captured my statement. The doctor heard on that tape lost his medical license 12 years ago for accepting financial kickbacks. And the woman standing in front of you. The woman demanding $10 million for fake patents is a woman who bribed a medical professional $50,000 to cover up the severe physical assault of a 16-year-old girl. Vanessa was physically trembling, her entire body shaking as the cameras swiveled back to her. She looked wildly at the church members who had accompanied her, hoping to find a single friendly face. But they were backing away from her, looking at her with total revulsion. She had led them to this plaza under the guise of Christian charity and devotion to a dying husband. Now they knew she was a violent, manipulative fraud who bought her way out of child abuse charges and used their sanctuary to launder stolen money. The silence finally broke. It did not break with a question, but with a unified roar from the press corps. The journalists realized they had just been handed the most explosive corporate and criminal scandal of the decade. The microphones pushed closer to Vanessa, trapping her against the metal barricades. Mrs. Hayes, is it true you assaulted your stepdaughter? Did you pay $50,000 to falsify medical records? Were you using your church to launder venture capital funds? Are the cardiovascular patents completely fabricated? She covered her face with her hands, trying to push her way back through the crowd, but there was nowhere for her to go. The people she had relied on to be her human shield were now actively blocking her retreat, disgusted by the monster hiding in plain sight. I stood on the steps watching the absolute destruction of her empire. She had demanded $10 million to spare my reputation. Instead, she had just broadcast her own criminal confession to the entire country and ensured that she would never manipulate another person for the rest of her life. The noise in the plaza transformed from an inquisitive roar into a frenzy of absolute chaos. The reporters surged against the metal barricades, shouting overlapping questions that echoed off the glass facade of the hospital headquarters. Camera flashes fired in a continuous blinding strobe effect, capturing every angle of Vanessa as her carefully constructed facade violently disintegrated. She was completely trapped. The sympathetic church members who had marched behind her just moments ago were now physically backing away, dropping their handmade signs onto the concrete. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She had used their faith, their community, and their sanctuary to launder stolen money and cover up child abuse. Vanessa frantically waved her hands in front of her face, trying to block the camera lenses. Her modest navy dress suddenly looked entirely inadequate as sweat beaded on her forehead, and her meticulously pulled back hair began to unravel. She looked wildly toward the street, searching for an escape route, but the media vans had completely blocked the avenue. "That recording is a fabrication!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as panic completely overtook her. "She is using artificial intelligence. She is manipulating the media. You cannot listen to her. I am a devoted wife. I am fighting for my dying husband. She is trying to silence me because I have the proof of her corporate theft." She thrust the forged yellow documents into the air again, but her hands were shaking so violently the papers fluttered like dead leaves. Nobody was buying her performance anymore. The reporters had smelled blood in the water and they were closing in for the kill. Mrs. Williams, a journalist from a major national network, shouted over the din. "Did your husband actually invent those patents, or did you forge them to extort $10 million from your stepdaughter?" "I did not forge anything," Vanessa screamed, gripping the wooden podium as if it were a life raft. "This is a setup." I stood at the top of the concrete steps, watching the spectacular implosion with perfect calm. I did not need to say another word. I had dropped the match, and the gasoline she had poured over her own life was doing the rest of the work. "Excuse me, step aside please, make way." A new voice, loud and authoritative, cut through the chaotic shouting of the press corps. From the left side of the plaza, a group of individuals pushed their way through the dense crowd of reporters. Two plainclothes detectives led the way, flashing gold badges, while three uniformed Atlanta police officers marched closely behind them. They moved with absolute tactical precision, bypassing the media and stepping directly into the secured area right in front of Vanessa. Vanessa froze, her frantic shouting dying in her throat. She stared at the badges glinting in the bright afternoon sunlight. The aggressive, defiant posture she had worn just seconds ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. "Vanessa Williams," the lead detective said, his voice projecting clearly over the ambient noise of the plaza. He did not bother to lower his volume. He knew every camera in the city was rolling, and he was acting on direct coordination with the federal agents who had just arrested her daughter Maya. "I am Detective Sanders with the Financial Crimes Unit," he continued, stepping right up to the wooden podium. "We have been monitoring this broadcast in coordination with federal authorities. We were originally dispatching a unit to your residence regarding the church money laundering investigation, but you made it very easy for us by broadcasting your location and committing multiple new felonies on live television." Vanessa swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically from the detective to the crowd of cameras documenting her absolute ruin. "Officer, there has been a terrible misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice dropping to a sickeningly sweet, pleading tone. "My stepdaughter and I are just having a private family dispute regarding my husband's medical care. She is trying to intimidate me, extorting a hospital network for $10 million, using falsified intellectual property documents, is not a family dispute, ma'am," the detective replied, his expression completely stone cold. "It is felony extortion and felony forgery, and based on the audio evidence regarding the bribery of a medical official and the severe endangerment of a minor, we have more than enough probable cause to take you into immediate custody." "No," Vanessa gasped, taking a stumbling step backward away from the podium. "You cannot do this. My husband is dying in a hospital bed right now. He needs me. I am the only one fighting for him." The detective did not entertain her theatrical excuses. He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," he instructed, stepping forward and grasping her upper arm. Vanessa snapped. The desperate realization that she had entirely run out of options broke the last remaining thread of her sanity. She ripped her arm away from the detective and began to thrash violently. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, dropping the yellowed forged documents onto the concrete where they were immediately trampled underfoot. "You cannot arrest me. I am a pillar of this community. I run the largest charity in this city. You are making a massive mistake. Chloe, tell them to stop. Tell them this is just a misunderstanding." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation. The woman who had shoved me into a glass table, the woman who had watched her husband throw me out into a thunderstorm, the woman who had tried to steal my inheritance and destroy my hospital was now begging me to save her. I looked down at her from the top of the stairs. I did not blink. I did not soften my expression. I gave her exactly what she had given me 19 years ago. Absolute chilling silence. The uniformed officers moved in swiftly, overwhelming her frantic resistance. They grabbed her wrists, forcing her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the plaza, a sound that brought me a profound, deep sense of closure. "Vanessa Williams, you are under arrest," the detective stated loudly, reading her Miranda rights as she thrashed against the officers holding her. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Vanessa ignored her rights entirely. As the officers turned her around and marched her down the steps toward a waiting patrol car, she completely lost her mind. She glared up at the news cameras, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred, showing the entire world the monster she truly was. "She planned this!" Vanessa screamed, fighting against the officer's grip as flashbulbs exploded around her. "She set my husband up. She set my daughter up. She is a vindictive, jealous orphan who ruined my family. She stole Serena Sterling's money and she used it to destroy us. You are all blind. She is a monster." The reporters continued to snap photos capturing every second of her unhinged meltdown. They documented the tears ruining her makeup, the frantic hatred in her eyes, and the absolute finality of her being shoved into the back seat of a police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off her frantic screaming. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, its lights flashing as it merged into the heavy Atlanta traffic, heading straight to the downtown precinct, where federal agents were already waiting to interrogate her about the millions of dollars she had laundered. The plaza slowly began to quiet down. The church members had completely dispersed, walking away in shame. The reporters turned their attention back to the top of the stairs where I was still standing, perfectly composed. Ms. Williams, a senior journalist, called out, his tone incredibly respectful. "Do you have a statement regarding the arrest of your stepmother and the allegations of forgery against your father?" I stepped forward, walking directly to the wooden podium Vanessa had just vacated. I placed my hands on the edges of the wood, looking out at the city I had conquered. Sterling Medical Holdings was built on a foundation of absolute integrity. I announced, my voice projecting power and reassurance to every investor, patient, and citizen watching the broadcast. Dr. Serena Sterling was a visionary pioneer who earned every single patent, every medical breakthrough, and every dollar of her billion-dollar empire through her own brilliant mind. I will not allow anyone to tarnish her legacy with fabricated documents or extortion tactics. I paused, ensuring the cameras captured my unwavering confidence. My administration has cooperated fully with federal authorities regarding the financial crimes committed by Connor and Maya Williams, I continued. And we will continue to cooperate regarding the charges against Vanessa. Sterling Medical has zero tolerance for corruption, fraud, or extortion, whether it comes from corporate competitors or biological relatives. We remain entirely focused on our mission to provide elite medical care to this state, and we look forward to our upcoming international expansion. Thank you. I stepped away from the podium, ignoring the flurry of follow-up questions. I walked back up the concrete steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors, returning to the quiet sanctuary of the hospital lobby. My executive assistant, David, was waiting for me just inside the doors. He looked at me with an expression of pure awe. "That was an incredible press conference, Ms. Williams," David said, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the private elevators. "The legal team just confirmed that the European investors watched the broadcast. They were extremely impressed by your decisive handling of the situation. The merger is absolutely secure." I nodded, feeling the tension slowly leaving my shoulders. The empire was safe. Connor was in a holding cell. Maya was facing federal indictment. Vanessa was wearing handcuffs. The board was completely cleared. But there was one final loose end. David stopped in front of the elevator banks, checking his digital tablet. "Ms. Williams, there is one more thing. We just received an urgent communication from the Surgical Coordination Desk at the Sterling Cardiovascular Institute across town." I turned to face him, my expression hardening. "What is the status?" "Calvin's preoperative window is closing," David explained, reading the alert. "The chief cardiovascular surgeon is requesting final authorization regarding his heart bypass procedure. The patient does not have the funds to cover the $250,000 surgical fee, and his out-of-network insurance claim has officially bounced. They are asking how you want to proceed." I looked at the digital display above the elevator, watching the numbers slowly descend. The man who had abandoned me at the emergency room doors 19 years ago was currently lying in a hospital bed entirely at my mercy. He had no wife to manipulate the system for him. He had no golden child to rely on. He was completely stripped of his arrogant power, waiting to see if the daughter he threw away would let his heart stop beating. "Tell my driver to bring the car around to the secure loading dock." "David," I instructed, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper. "I am going to the Cardiovascular Institute right now. It is time for me to have a final conversation with my father." The drive across Atlanta took exactly 14 minutes. I sat in the back of my car, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. The adrenaline from the press conference had completely faded, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. I was heading to the Sterling Cardiovascular Institute, the crown jewel of my medical empire. It was a massive state-of-the-art facility dedicated entirely to keeping hearts beating. And currently, the man who had broken mine 19 years ago was lying inside it, waiting to see if I would let him live. My car glided into the reserved executive parking bay. The security team had already cleared a path for me. I stepped out into the warm afternoon air and walked toward the private entrance. As I approached the building, the heavy glass doors automatically slid open to welcome me. I paused for a fraction of a second, stepping over the threshold. It was the exact same style of automatic sliding doors Calvin had shoved me out of during that thunderstorm so many years ago. The profound poetry of the moment was not lost on me. He had thrown me out of a hospital to protect a lie, and now I owned the very doors he was hiding behind. I took the private elevator up to the pre-operative surgical floor. The atmosphere here was incredibly quiet, a stark contrast to the media circus I had just left behind. The nurses and attending physicians nodded to me with absolute deference as I walked down the pristine, brightly lit corridor. I did not stop at the nurse's station. I walked directly to room 402. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside the private suite. The room was dominated by the rhythmic mechanical beeping of a heart monitor. Calvin was lying in the center of the mechanical bed, elevated at a slight angle. The robust, arrogant man who had screamed at me in the steakhouse parking lot was completely gone. In his place was a frail, terrified patient, wrapped in a thin, faded hospital gown. His skin was an unhealthy shade of gray, and translucent medical tubing snaked across his chest and arms. I was not looking at the door when I walked in. His eyes were glued to the flat-screen television mounted on the opposite wall. The television was playing the local news on a continuous silent loop. The closed captioning scrolled rapidly across the bottom of the screen. The broadcast was showing the exact moment Vanessa was shoved into the back of the police cruiser, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. The news anchor then cut to footage of Maya wearing a gray federal jumpsuit being escorted into a courthouse. The text on the screen confirmed that Maya had been denied bail, and Vanessa was facing multiple felony charges including extortion and bribery. Calvin was watching his entire world turn to ash. His perfect suburban life, his arrogant sense of superiority, his wealthy wife and his golden child were all completely obliterated in the span of a single afternoon. He had spent 2 decades building a fortress of lies, and he was watching the final bricks crumble on live television. I stepped further into the room, letting the door click shut behind me. Calvin turned his head slowly. When his eyes locked onto me, his breath caught in his throat, triggering a weak, rattling cough. He reached up with a trembling hand and pressed the button to turn off the television, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the steady beat of his failing heart. We stared at each other. There was no rage left in him. There was no bluster, no demanding tone, no expectation of obedience. He was looking at a billionaire chief executive officer who held absolute supreme power over his immediate future. "The billing administrator was just here," Calvin whispered. His voice was incredibly thin, sounding like dry leaves scraping across pavement. I did not say anything. I stood at the foot of his hospital bed, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, projecting the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a terminal case. "They told me my insurance policy was flagged." Calvin continued, his chest heaving with the effort required to speak. "The federal agents froze all of Vanessa's accounts this morning. The insurance company retroactively canceled my coverage because Vanessa had been using stolen money to pay the premium installments. The hospital administrator said that, because I am out of network and currently uninsured, I have to pay the $250,000 surgical fee out of pocket by 5 o'clock tonight." He swallowed hard, tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. "If I do not pay the balance by 5 o'clock, they are going to remove me from the surgical schedule," Calvin choked out. "They are going to discharge me. My heart is failing, Chloe. The specialist told me that if I leave this hospital without the bypass procedure, I will not survive the week." I watched a single tear spill over his lash line and track through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. It was a remarkable sight. For my entire life, Calvin had been a wall of stone. He had never showed an ounce of vulnerability. Now, facing the absolute certainty of his own mortality and the complete destruction of his family, he was finally breaking. "I have absolutely nothing left." Calvin wept, the facade completely shattering. "I called my bank. The accounts are completely drained. Vanessa took everything we had in liquid cash to pay a retainer fee for a criminal defense attorney. She emptied our joint savings to protect herself and Maya. She knew I needed this surgery and she left me here to die. She did not even leave enough to cover my copay." He reached out a shaking hand toward me, his fingers grasping at the empty air above his blanket. "I am so sorry, Chloe," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate plea. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything." I remained perfectly still. I did not step forward to take his hand. I let his arm drop back down onto the mattress. "You are sorry that you have no money, Calvin?" I asked, my tone dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. "Or are you sorry that the woman you chose over your own daughter just abandoned you the exact same way you abandoned me?" "I was a coward," Calvin cried, burying his face in his trembling hands. "I was so terrified of Vanessa. I was afraid of losing the lifestyle she provided. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I looked the other way because it was easy. I convinced myself that you were strong enough to survive on your own so I would not have to feel guilty about throwing you away. I was a weak, pathetic man. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, practically begging for a shred of sympathy. I remember the rain, Calvin, I said, speaking slowly, forcing him to hear every single syllable. I remember the cold leather of your car seats. I remember bleeding onto my shirt and pleading with you to just walk me inside the emergency room. I was 16 years old. I was your child. And you looked me in the eye and told me I was a burden. You told me to never come back. Please, Calvin begged, violently shaking his head. Please do not do this. I know I deserve your anger. I know I deserve to be punished. But please, Chloe, I do not want to die. I am terrified. I have nowhere else to go. Nobody else can help me. You are the only one left. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, straining against the hospital bed. I am begging you. Calvin wept, the heart monitor accelerating as his panic peaked. I will sign whatever you want. I will publicly confess to everything. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. Just please authorize this surgery. You own the hospital. You have the power to save me. Please save my life. I stood at the foot of his bed, watching the man who had caused me 19 years of profound, agonizing pain reduce himself to an absolute puddle of desperation. This was the moment I had envisioned 1,000 times in my darkest hours. This was the ultimate reversal of power. He was completely stripped of his dignity, his wealth, and his pride. He was entirely at my mercy. I let the silence stretch out, allowing his desperate sobs to fill the sterile room. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating, helpless terror that I had felt standing on that wet concrete so many years ago. I wanted him to understand that the universe demands a profound and absolute balance. You cannot throw away a child and expect to reap the rewards of her success. The clock on the wall ticked forward. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. He had exactly 30 minutes left before the surgical wing officially canceled his procedure. The realization caused Calvin to let out a low, agonizing moan of pure defeat. He slumped back against the hospital pillows, burying his face in the thin white blankets, completely surrendering to the consequences of his own horrific choices. The digital clock on the sterile white wall shifted to 4:35 in the afternoon. Calvin lay completely motionless against the elevated hospital pillows, his chest hitching with every ragged, shallow breath. He was staring blankly at the ceiling, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he could already feel the cold, heavy grip of his own mortality closing around his failing heart. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of arrogance and cruelty, and now he was trapped inside the smoking ruins of it, waiting for his time to run out. I stood at the foot of his mechanical bed, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room. I watched him experience the exact same paralyzing, helpless terror he had forced upon me 19 years ago. He was finally feeling the absolute crushing weight of being completely discarded by the people who were supposed to care about him. Vanessa had abandoned him to save herself. Maya was sitting in a federal holding cell. His wealthy friends had vanished the second the scandal broke on local television. He was entirely untethered from the world. Calvin let out another low, agonizing moan, turning his face toward the window, unable to look at me anymore. He was waiting for me to turn around and walk out the door. He was waiting for 5 o'clock to strike so the hospital administrators could officially cancel his life-saving procedure and send him home to die in a foreclosed house. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I stepped around the foot of the bed and walked over to his side. The movement drew his attention, and he flinched slightly as if expecting a physical blow. "Do you really think I am anything like you, Calvin?" I asked, my voice cutting through the steady, rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor. "Do you really believe I would look at a bleeding, vulnerable person and just walk away to protect my own convenience?" Calvin swallowed hard, his dry throat clicking. He looked up at me with raw, desperate confusion. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy hospital stationery. It was stamped with the official seal of the Sterling Cardiovascular Institute. I placed it gently on the rolling tray table, positioning it directly in his line of sight. "You are not being removed from the surgical schedule," I said, looking down at his pale, trembling face. "Your complex bypass procedure is officially confirmed for 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. The top cardiovascular surgeon in the state will be performing the operation. You will have a private recovery suite and the best post-operative care this network has to offer. Calvin stared at the paper. His eyes darted rapidly across the printed text, reading the confirmation codes and the zero balance due at the bottom of the invoice. His mouth fell open and a fresh wave of tears spilled over his cheeks, washing away the gray, terrifying ash of his impending death. He let out a loud, gasping sob of pure, overwhelming relief. "You paid for it!" Calvin wept, his voice cracking as he reached a shaking hand out, trying to grasp my sleeve. "Chloe, you paid the $250,000. You saved my life. I knew you still cared. I knew you could not just let your father die. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will make this right. I promise I will make this up to you." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring his grasping fingers met nothing but empty air. I did not soften my expression. I did not offer him a single ounce of warmth. I looked at the man who had thrown me away like garbage, and I delivered the final devastating blow to his ego. "Not because I love you," I stated coldly, my voice completely void of any affection or forgiveness, "but because Serena Sterling taught me that my hospital turns no one away. You get to live, Calvin. But you get to live knowing your wife is in prison, your golden child is facing federal charges, and the daughter you threw away like trash just bought your life." The desperate, grateful smile instantly vanished from Calvin's face. His hand dropped heavily back onto the mattress. The reality of my words slammed into him with the force of a physical impact. He was not receiving grace. He was receiving the ultimate, inescapable punishment. "If I let you die today, your suffering would be over." I continued pacing slowly beside his bed. "You would escape the consequences of everything you allowed to happen in your house. But Serena taught me that true justice requires a living, breathing audience. So you are going to survive this surgery, Calvin. You are going to recover. And then you are going to wake up in a very quiet, very empty world." He stared at me, his chest heaving as the absolute devastation of his future finally dawned on him. He was going to live, but his life was entirely over. He would have to sit in a courtroom and watch his wife be sentenced for extortion and bribery. He would have to watch his favorite daughter go to federal prison for laundering stolen money. He would have to move out of his luxury estate and figure out how to survive on a fractured reputation, while the entire city of Atlanta knew exactly what kind of monster he truly was. And every single time his newly repaired heart took a beat in his chest, he would be forced to remember that he only drew breath because I allowed it. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a thick, stapled legal document. I dropped it onto his tray table right on top of the surgical confirmation invoice. "This is a permanent, legally binding, non-contact order." I explained, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "It has already been filed with the state and signed by a superior court judge. You are expressly forbidden from contacting me by phone, by mail, through third parties, or in person for the rest of your natural life. You are forbidden from contacting any administrative office within Sterling Medical Holdings. If you attempt to breach this order in any capacity, my corporate legal team will have you arrested and jailed before you can even finish dialing my number." Calvin looked down at the legal document and let out a broken, pathetic sob. "Chloe, please," he whimpered, closing his eyes as the tears flowed freely. "I have nothing left." "I know," I replied, my tone sharp and immaculate. "And now you know exactly how I felt standing in the rain outside the emergency room doors 19 years ago." I did not wait for him to open his eyes. I did not wait for another apology I did not want or need. I turned my back on the man who shared my DNA and walked toward the heavy wooden door of the hospital suite. I reached out and grasped the chrome handle, pulling the door open and stepping out into the bright, pristine corridor. I let the door swing shut behind me, hearing the solid click of the latch seal. Calvin away in his own personal purgatory. The sound of his weeping was instantly cut off, leaving me standing in the quiet, efficient hum of the surgical wing. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, sterile air fill my lungs. I did not feel a single ounce of lingering sadness. I did not feel grief for the father I never really had. I felt a profound, immense sense of completion. The open wound I had been carrying since I was 16 years old had finally been stitched closed. I walked down the hallway, the nurses and attending physicians nodding to me with deep respect as I passed their stations. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The brass doors slid shut, and I descended through the heart of the empire Serena and I had built together. When I reached the main lobby, the afternoon sun was streaming through the massive glass facade, casting long golden shadows across the polished marble floor. The chaotic media circus outside had been completely cleared away by the police, leaving the front plaza peaceful and quiet. I walked across the lobby, my posture perfect, my head held high. The automatic sliding glass doors parted smoothly as I approached them, welcoming me out into the warm, humid Atlanta evening. 19 years ago, I had stood on concrete just like this, bleeding, terrified, and completely abandoned. Now I was walking out of those doors as a conqueror. There was no hesitation in my stride. There was just the sharp, satisfying sound of my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, echoing with the absolute certainty of my power. My black chauffeured town car was waiting patiently at the curb. David stood by the rear passenger side, opening the heavy armored door for me with a respectful nod. "Everything is secure, Ms. Williams," David said quietly. "I know, David," I replied, returning his nod with a genuine, relaxed smile. I stepped into the back of the car, settling into the plush leather seat as the door closed firmly behind me. The engine purred to life with a quiet, dominant strength. As the car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the vibrant flow of the city traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the towering glass and steel monument of Sterling Medical Holdings. I had protected my legacy. I had eradicated the parasites. And as I rode into the beautiful southern sunset, I knew that for the first time in my entire life, I was completely, entirely free. Looking back on the ashes of what was supposed to be my family, the greatest lesson I learned is that blood does not automatically grant someone the title of family. True family is forged through unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and the conscious choice to protect one another in the darkest of storms. For 19 years, I believed that my worth was tied to the validation of people who were entirely committed to destroying me. I thought that by surviving their cruelty, I would eventually earn their love. I was wrong. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of surrender. It is the ultimate declaration of self-respect. When they closed the door on a bleeding teenager, they thought they had discarded a burden. Instead, they forced me to discover an undeniable, resilient power within myself. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your resources to those who only value you when it serves their own selfish agenda. Have you ever had to establish firm, unapologetic boundaries with toxic family members? How did you find the courage to finally walk away? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming power and demanding respect resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and truth.